Hey guys, tonight we're unravelling a tale so tightly laced, you might need smelling salts before the halfway point. We're diving into the moody, buttoned-up, pearl-clutching world of Victorian England, a place where ankles caused existential crises, table legs were scandalous, and somehow entire lives were lived without anyone admitting they had, a body. But don't be fooled by all the doilies and moral posturing. Beneath the lace and moral outrage is a bubbling stew of repression, hypocrisy, and quiet obsession. And yeah, spoiler alert, you probably won't survive this. Not because it's dangerous, but because the level of denial is so deep it might actually suffocate you. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. It really helps keep the lights on, or dimmed in this case. Drop your city and what time you're tuning in down in the comments. I want to know which night owls are creeping through history with me. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself stepping into a world defined by contradiction. It's 1837, Queen Victoria has just taken the throne, and the air smells faintly of coal smoke and propriety. On the surface, everything seems neatly pressed and morally upright, but right away you sense something's off. Like everyone's performing a role in a play they're too embarrassed to admit they didn't audition for. Public life is governed by rigid codes. Men are expected to be noble, honourable, emotionally constipated pillars of the empire. Women, chaste, delicate, and forever teetering between saintly and scandalous. If you so much as suggest that someone might enjoy anything below the neck, you're either a doctor on the verge of disgrace or a novelist banned from polite society. The rules are so strict they begin to bend space-time, sucking everyone into an emotional black hole where curiosity dies quietly in a corner. But the irony, everything is still about sex, just not openly. You'll see, couples marry with no clue what their wedding night entails, women write letters confessing confusion about the marital duty, and doctors whisper things about nervous conditions, with such intense vehement vagueness you'd think they were describing a haunted hat. Here's the real kicker. Victorians didn't completely erase sex, they just buried it under layers of euphemism, ritual and control, like hiding a volcano under a lace doily. The obsession didn't vanish, it mutated. Every form of repression created a counter-movement in secret. Erotic literature flourished in back rooms, brothels operated practically next door to churches. Even the art on your neighbour's mantelpiece might have some deeply symbolic fig leaf arrangement that suggests way more than it lets on. The truth? Sex wasn't absent. It was everywhere, just smothered in anxiety and veiled in poetry. And if you're a woman, forget it. The rules are twice as strict and 3 times as punishing. You're supposed to be pure, docile, and completely ignorant. If you ask questions, you're immodest. If you enjoy yourself, you're degenerate. If you don't enjoy yourself, well, that's how it should be. Welcome to the psychological escape room of the Victorian mind. Even furniture isn't safe. There's an old story, possibly apocryphal, but far too perfect not to mention, that Victorian households covered the legs of pianos and tables because legs were too suggestive. No one's entirely sure if this was a widespread practice or just one hysterical moment amplified by the telephone game of history, but the fact that it's believable tells you everything you need to know. It's the kind of detail that captures the paranoid energy of an era, afraid that even inanimate objects might get ideas. And while all this was going on, you had another layer. The Empire. Victorian England was not just a cultural bubble, it was a colonial one. The British were exporting their moral code across the globe, mixing moral superiority with thinly veiled racism and control. They imagined themselves as bringing civilization to the world, which conveniently also meant exporting their prudishness and telling other cultures how to behave, especially when it came to sexuality, clothing and gender roles. Because nothing says global power like shaming everyone equally. Now here's a fun little wrinkle. The people shouting the loudest about morality were often the ones hiding the most. You'll see it again and again. Priests with mistress, politicians visiting brothels after passing morality laws, and upper-class families so desperate to maintain appearances they'll send a daughter away for 9 months and pretend she's visiting relatives. Entire careers were built on moral grandstanding while secret affairs unfolded behind closed curtains, or in some cases, behind those piano legs. Scholars still argue whether this repression was genuinely believed by most Victorians or simply performed to maintain status. Some historians argue that Victorians truly believed in purity, that the prudishness was sincere, even if damaging. Others say it was all a strategic performance, social theatre designed to maintain power structures and enforce rigid gender roles. Who's right? Probably a bit of both. The upper classes had the luxury of faking it better, while the working classes bore the brunt of real consequences. And here's the most curious thing: the era was bursting with contradictions. The same society that published thousands of etiquette manuals also devoured salacious novels under pseudonyms. The same queen who publicly embodied maternal virtue wrote love letters to her husband that make modern romance novels look tame. The Victorian mind was like a giant corset, tight, structured, and full of hidden tension. Every restriction created a private rebellion. Every don't came with a whispered do, but don't tell. So as you step fully into this world, just remember, you're entering a place where no one says what they mean, everyone is pretending, and the word intimate means everything and absolutely nothing. Every polite smile hides a nervous tic. Every embroidered handkerchief is a stand-in for feelings that must not be named. And under all that lace, an earthquake just waiting to break the surface, Queen Victoria, bless her stern little heart, didn't exactly invent prudishness, but she definitely became its best brand ambassador. It's 1837 again, and you're in a candlelit drawing room where everyone's a bit too obsessed with looking like they've never had a bodily function. At the centre of this whole sparkling charade is Victoria herself, a tiny woman with a massive influence who somehow becomes the human embodiment of moral restraint. The irony? She was anything but dispassionate in her private life. But we'll get to that. You sit back and watch as the crown settles on her head, and suddenly society shifts. There's something about a young queen, not yet 20, projecting innocence and duty, that makes everyone lean a little harder into respectability. Victorian values, though really a messy remix of older Christian piety and Enlightenment hangovers, get vacuum-packed into a shiny, respectable package. She's not the first monarch to influence social behaviour, but under Victoria, personal restraint becomes a public virtue. Her image as a pure, devoted wife and grieving widow becomes the national mood board. Monogamy? Sacred. Family values? Non-negotiable. Talking about anything even remotely carnal? Nope, that would be unbecoming. Here's the twist. Behind palace doors, Victoria's personal letters to Prince Albert reveal a woman far more passionate than the marble statue her public image suggests. She adored him, not just intellectually, but physically. Her private writings hint at a very enthusiastic marital connection. She used flowery, affectionate, even lusty language in ways that would make her publicists faint. But that's the part no one saw. The version people were shown was pristine, draped in black crepe and duty. The royal couple had 9 children, which is a biological indicator that they weren't just playing chess in the evenings. But the way society interpreted their relationship was deeply sanitized. The message the public absorbed was this: love is noble, sex is silent, and women exist in a state of eternal maternity. Once you're a wife and mother, your sensuality gets neatly filed away, preferably under never discussed again. And so the Victorians took their cues. It became fashionable to downplay desire and promote restraint. Men were told to be protectors and providers, women to be modest and gentle. Not only that, entire scientific disciplines began reflecting this ideology. Think of it like a moral trickle-down effect. Queen Victoria wept publicly for her late husband, and suddenly, public grief became acceptable, but only if it was tasteful, feminine, and prolonged. If the Queen was the grieving widow for 40 years, then a woman mourning for 6 months clearly didn't love hard enough. What's truly fascinating is how this filtered down even to the most mundane things. Portraiture, for instance. Look at a royal family painting from earlier monarchs and you'll find flamboyance, rich colours, and cheeky overtones. But with Victoria, everything is toned down. Her portraits are staid, proper, almost aggressively dull. She's posed like a saint. Demure gaze, subtle embroidery, a baby or two strategically placed to show she's fertile but not overtly sexual. The ideal woman, apparently, is one whose sensuality is always implied but never visible. Now here's the deeper weirdness. For someone who ruled during an age of incredible scientific advancement and industrial progress, Victoria's influence somehow dragged cultural attitudes about sex back into the shadows. While steam engines roared and surgical practices advanced, the moral messaging around sexuality became more muted, more coded, more claustrophobic. It's like the more control Britain exerted over the world, the less control people had over their own impulses. There's a quirky historical note here too. Victoria reportedly didn't believe that women were capable of lesbian desire, as in it didn't even register in her worldview. Parliament tried to pass laws criminalising homosexuality across the board, but she allegedly refused to sign off on the part involving women because, in her view, it simply didn't exist. Whether that's entirely accurate or a myth created to soften her image later on is still up for debate. But again, it's very on-brand. If a thing couldn't be spoken of, it couldn't be real. And then there's Albert, Prince Consort and equal opportunity mood dampener. He was all about moral reform, good governance, and being very, very proper. He believed in education, discipline, and encouraging young men to embrace self-restraint. The Christian gentleman was his ideal. Hard-working, celibate until marriage, and preferably always 5 minutes away from quoting scripture. Albert, like Victoria, had a genuine love for his spouse, but that love became a model for a kind of sanitized domestic bliss. Their partnership was held up as the ultimate moral example, even as it quietly demanded people erase parts of their humanity. In public, the royal couple leaned into this sanitized vision of the home. They walked with dignity, raised their children with structure, and attended church with such regularity that even the clergy felt slightly judged. Their model family was used to elevate the nuclear household as the foundation of moral society. Everyone wanted to emulate them, even if it meant pretending that natural urges simply didn't exist. The question historians keep batting around is, did Victoria know what her image was doing to the culture? Was she actively curating a prudish society, or did that just naturally happen around her? Some argue she was the product of her time, swept along by the wave of mid-19th century religiosity and social control. Others claim she was fully aware of the weight of her example and leaned into it as a tool for national unity. It's hard to say, but either way, her image became gospel. This sets the stage for the great cultural masquerade of the Victorian era. People began performing morality with the intensity of Shakespearean actors. Even when no one was watching, they whispered in euphemism, prayed for deliverance from impure thoughts, and pretended that babies came from God's mysterious blessing rather than human bodies doing what human bodies do. So here you are, a guest at a dinner party in 1845. The ladies are talking about embroidery and digestion. The gentlemen sip brandy and talk about crops, politics and railways. Everyone looks so calm, so polite, but just beneath the surface. Tension, secrets. Someone has a mistress. Someone else has a locked drawer with illustrated French novels. Another is contemplating whether their son's nervous disposition is just puberty or something more sinful, if one says anything directly. But everyone knows. Thanks, Victoria. You didn't invent repression, but you did give it the crown. You wake up in a Victorian bedroom, chilly, prim, and absolutely drowning in fabric. There are about 6 layers between you and the outside world. Lace curtains, heavy drapes, nightclothes buttoned up to your collarbone, and a coverlet so thick it could probably stop a bayonet. Welcome to the great cover-up, quite literally. In Victorian England, modesty isn't just a virtue, it's a daily performance stitched into every article of clothing and every item of home decor. The more skin you cover, the more moral you are, or at least the more moral people think you are, and that's really what matters here. The first thing that hits you is the sheer absurdity of it all. Women are corseted, layered, petticoated, crinolined, and draped to within an inch of their lives. You could hide a whole roast chicken under some of these skirts and no one would notice. And men aren't exactly lounging around in swim trunks either. Starched collars, waistcoats, pocket watches, hats, for every occasion. Nothing is casual, nothing is breezy, everything is calculated to suppress the body and, by extension, the idea that bodies do anything scandalous like sweat or desire things. And let's talk about those table legs. Yes, the infamous claim that Victorians were so prudish they covered piano legs to prevent arousal. It's a story repeated in history books, lectures, and late-night trivia games. The problem, it might not be entirely true, or at least not widespread. There's some evidence that leg coverings were more about protecting expensive furniture from dust and wear than protecting fragile male minds from carnal thoughts. But it doesn't matter whether it was fact or fable, the idea caught on because it fits so neatly with everything else in the era. It feels true, and that says more about Victorian attitudes than any census report ever could. Even language gets involved. Words like leg and breast are tiptoed around in polite company. A chicken dinner becomes a linguistic obstacle course. White meat instead of breast, dark meat for thigh, and heaven help you if you ask for a drumstick with too much enthusiasm. Euphemism becomes a second language. You don't say someone is pregnant, you say they're in a delicate condition. Underwear is unmentionables. Lingerie, not even a concept. There's a whole industry of communication designed to obscure and deny what everyone already knows. And fashion. Oh, fashion is both armour and straitjacket. For women especially, getting dressed is a full contact sport. First the chemise, then the drawers, then the corset, then the crinoline or bustle, then the dress, which usually comes in 2 or 3 parts, then the jacket, gloves, bonnet, parasol. A woman could spend an hour just getting herself scaffolded together to go outside. And all of this isn't just about style, it's a physical manifestation of moral superiority. The more uncomfortable and layered you are, the more virtuous you appear. And corsets, let's not even pretend those were comfortable. They weren't just meant to shape the body, they were meant to discipline it. A woman laced into a corset couldn't move freely, couldn't breathe deeply, couldn't slouch or sprawl or express emotion with her whole body. Everything was constrained, controlled. That's the point. A tightly cinched waist was a visual shorthand for chastity, modesty, and self-control. Sure, it might compress your organs and make you faint occasionally, but at least no one could accuse you of being immodest. Men had their own version of this, of course. Starched collars so stiff they could leave marks, shoes so narrow they pinched the feet, layers of wool and flannel even in summer. The Victorian man was expected to endure discomfort with silent stoicism, to signal his social worth by dressing like someone constantly prepared for an emergency board meeting. Even facial hair became political. Moustaches and beards were symbols of masculinity, but they had to be perfectly trimmed. A sloppy beard was a moral failing. A wild moustache might hint at anarchist sympathies or, worse, French habits. There's an open debate among historians about how sincerely Victorians believed in these modesty rituals. Some argue it was an organic cultural shift driven by religious revivalism and fear of social instability. Others think it was performative, a way to maintain class boundaries and gender roles under the guise of morality. Were people genuinely scandalised by a glimpse of ankle? Or was the outrage part of a game everyone agreed to play? Maybe both. Maybe repression is always part performance, part belief. Either way, the effect is the same. Bodies disappear under fabric, and with them, a whole world of human experience. Here's a fringe fact to make you tilt your head. Some Victorians believed that tight clothing on women could help suppress impure urges. The logic being, if your body is locked down and uncomfortable, you're less likely to think impure thoughts. Which, okay, maybe, but the flip side of that logic is chilling. That comfort and physical ease might be dangerous. That relaxation leads to sin. It turns the body into something to be battled, not celebrated, and it turns pleasure into the enemy. In this environment, even furniture gets nervously modest. Sofas with curved backs are viewed with suspicion. Art Nouveau's sinuous curves make Victorians sweat, and not in the fun way. Interior decorators actually debate how sensual a carved wood flourish can be. The ideal Victorian room is plush, formal, and just a little bit joyless. Nothing is too bright, too bare, too spontaneous. Aesthetic restraint mirrors the moral restraint expected of its occupants. And you start to feel it yourself. The weight of layers, the awareness that someone, somewhere might be watching or judging. Every movement becomes self-conscious, every gesture measured. Even laughter is subdued, carefully modulated to avoid drawing attention. You begin to understand how repression becomes internalized. You don't just hide your body. You hide your thoughts, your impulses, your questions. You learn not to ask, not to wonder, not to want. But here's the contradiction again, looping back like a stubborn vine. The more society tries to suppress sensuality, the more it becomes fetishized. The hidden becomes magnetic. The unseen, irresistible. An uncovered ankle becomes a scandal because it's so rarely glimpsed. A glimpse of collarbone can unspool someone's entire composure. In trying to eradicate desire, Victorian society made it omnipresent. Every ruffle, every button, every whispered euphemism becomes erotically charged simply because it's not supposed to be. So you walk down the street in 1851, your layers rustling like a tent in the wind. A man tips his hat. A woman adjusts her gloves. Everyone looks composed. But you know better now. You know what's boiling under those collars and corsets. Not just bodies, but questions, curiosity, frustration, denial. It's not just a cover-up, it's a containment strategy. And the cracks are starting to show. You're now seated in a gentleman's study, dark wood, leather-bound books, and a faint smell of pipe tobacco that's somehow both calming and pretentious. A mustachioed doctor sits across from you, peering over his spectacles with the gravitas of someone who believes he's solved the mysteries of the universe, but still thinks female anatomy is an optical illusion. Welcome to the golden age of moralized science, where men with impeccable facial hair and dubious diplomas invent entire theories about sexuality without ever saying the word sex. In Victorian England, science and morality don't sit on opposite ends of the spectrum. They share a love seat and exchange nervous glances. The emerging class of doctors, biologists and philosophers aren't just trying to understand the body, they're trying to control it. You get the sense that every lecture on the dangers of nervous excitation is less about data and more about keeping people in line. This is the era when your spleen, your posture and your soul are all up for diagnosis. And the big boogeyman of the day? Overstimulation. Not in the fun way, more in the if you think too hard about a woman's wrist you might unravel kind of way. Victorian scientists love linking sexual desire with disease, madness and moral failure. You hear words like degeneracy, feebleness and melancholia tossed around like confetti. Got a headache? Too many impure thoughts? Trouble sleeping? Probably thinking about corsets again. Your pulse speeds up when someone brushes your hand. Quick, call for the smelling salts and the family priest. One particularly strange concept floating around is the belief in spermatic economy. Essentially the idea that a man's supply of sperm is limited and each release shortens his lifespan. Every nocturnal emission, every secret indulgence is framed as a tiny death, physically, spiritually and intellectually. This turns the male body into a leaky cauldron of existential risk. Too much pleasure and you become weak, foolish, possibly even criminal. You're not just wasting fluid, you're wasting potential. So doctors start giving out advice that would be laughable if it weren't so devastating. Young boys are told to avoid spicy foods and novels with female protagonists. Cold baths, bland diets, tight sleeping schedules, these become tools of self-preservation. A growing trend of anti-masturbation devices hits the market, complete with spikes, straps and tiny locks. Some parents even sew special pyjamas shut to keep their children's hands away from the danger zone. You suddenly feel very grateful for your own boring modern pyjamas. Women, of course, aren't excluded from the fun, but their bodies are treated more like mysterious haunted houses than leaky faucets. Most doctors claim women lack sexual desire altogether, unless they're mentally unstable. So if a woman does express curiosity or passion, it's considered a sign of illness. Hysteria becomes the go-to diagnosis, a one-size-fits-all label for any behaviour that deviates from soft-spoken, demure compliance. Restlessness, hysteria. Mood swings, hysteria. Asking too many questions, you guessed it, hysteria. The treatment, usually more layers of repression. Some women are confined to bed rest, forbidden from reading, socialising or moving around too much. Others are sent to water cures or isolated in country estates. It's the psychiatric version of putting a blanket over a fire and pretending it's out. Occasionally, if the husband or father feels especially magnanimous, the afflicted woman might be sent to a doctor who offers therapeutic bronchoid massages. And yes, it's exactly what you think, delivered with straight-faced clinical detachment. That's a story for another section, but let's just say no one was making eye contact afterward. Meanwhile, back in the study, the doctor is now lecturing you about the shape of skulls. Welcome to phrenology, one of the more absurd pseudosciences of the century. The Victorians believed you could determine a person's moral character by feeling the bumps on their head. A pronounced forehead. You're intelligent. A dent behind the ear? Probably a thief. Horny? There's a bump for that too. Phrenology charts become household items. And suddenly, everyone's personalities is being read like a topographical map of shame. And yet, despite how laughable some of this sounds now, it had real consequences. These theories filtered into public policy, education, even criminal justice. Schools taught that certain types of boys were predisposed to degeneracy. Women were denied education for fear it might inflame their delicate nerves. and those who didn't fit into the neat boxes, especially the poor, the disabled, the queer, were quietly pushed out of view, institutionalised, or simply erased from polite society. There's a real scholarly debate about whether the scientists of this era believed their own theories or were simply dressing up cultural fears in lab coats. Were they earnestly trying to map human behaviour, or just creating intellectual scaffolding for existing prejudices? Some probably thought they were doing good. Others likely knew they were cherry-picking data to prop up an anxious, fragile status quo. Either way, the effect is the same. Curiosity is dangerous, desire is pathological, and science becomes another tool for moral policing. One fringe fact to tie a bow on this. The Victorians believed that nocturnal emissions in men could cause spontaneous combustion. That's right, bursting into flames, like a cautionary tale in a pub after too many ales. No actual cases were documented, of course, but it didn't stop moralists from warning boys that the devil would burn the sin out of you. You can't make this stuff up. Well, they did, but still. So you leave the study a little shaken, maybe questioning your own pulse rate. The whole world feels like it's operating under a massive misunderstanding of biology and emotion, but it's all been medicalised so thoroughly that no one's allowed to call it out. You're told that feelings are symptoms, pleasure is a disease, and silence is the cure, and this, somehow, is progress. Out on the foggy street you pass an apothecary window filled with tonics, pills, and powders, each promising to correct your innermost wrongness. But none of them work, not really, because the sickness isn't in the body, it's in the fear of the body. The morning light filters through lace curtains, and you're immediately reminded this is not a time for comfort or curiosity. It's a time for clenched jaws, tightly laced corsets, and the ever-looming fear that if you touch yourself under the covers, you might literally die. Welcome to the Victorian panic over masturbation, a moral crusade so intense it makes medieval guilt look like a spa weekend. Today's agenda: don't touch anything, especially not yourself, or face consequences ranging from blindness to insanity to spontaneous combustion. And no, that wasn't hyperbole back then. That was Tuesday. You're a teenage boy in a middle-class household in 1855. Your parents are decent, church-going people who love you very much, and are absolutely terrified of your genitals. So one day, your father sits you down and hands you a pamphlet titled Onanism, The Self-Pollution of the Soul, written by a doctor with a magnificent beard and a very shaky grasp of human anatomy. You're not entirely sure what self-pollution means, but the illustrations are terrifying. One shows a skeletal figure slumped in a chair. Another shows a young man with sunken eyes and hair falling out, labelled Before. The after is a fresh-faced gentleman standing beside his moral saviour a bucket of cold water. The idea here isn't just that masturbation is a bad habit, it's that it's a moral catastrophe, a gateway drug to lunacy, physical decay and eternal damnation. Doctors, clergy and educators all pile onto the panic. One widely distributed manual warns that loss of seminal fluid leads to spinal weakness, stunted growth, pimples and memory loss. Another claims it drains the vital essence from the brain. So now, every time a boy has a thought about ankles, he's half convinced he's given himself irreversible brain damage. It's like puberty, but with fear-based marketing. And don't think girls are off the hook either. Though female sexuality is so under-discussed, it's practically a rumour, the same terror applies, just in a more condescending tone. Women who exhibit unnatural interest in their own bodies are considered deviant, unstable, or worst of all, unfit for marriage. Their curiosity is not only dangerous, it's diagnostic. A woman who touches herself is not just immoral, she's mentally ill. Hysteria, melancholy, moral insanity, all tidy ways to say, she asked a question we didn't want to answer. Now if you're thinking surely they didn't invent actual devices to stop this, oh friend, they did. Welcome to the world of anti-masturbation tools. For boys it's metal mittens, groin cages, even alarms that sound when movement is detected. Some parents were encouraged to bind their children's hands at night. Others used special ointments designed to burn if applied to sensitive skin. There were even circumcisions done without anaesthesia to use a corrective measure. This wasn't fringe science. This was mainstream, endorsed by major physicians and moral leaders. You pass through a boarding school, where the dormitory rules include mandatory cold sponge baths, nighttime inspections, and strict prohibition of any unsupervised alone time. Discipline becomes obsession. Blankets must be no higher than the waist, Hands must remain outside the covers. Any boy caught violating these rules might be subjected to public shaming, corporal punishment, or forced withdrawal from school. The motto? Better humiliated than damned. This campaign of fear and shame was rooted in a potent cocktail of a religious dogma, outdated biology, and a cultural belief that willpower defined moral worth. The Victorians were obsessed with self-control. Your body wasn't just a vessel, it was a test. And if you failed, even privately, you weren't just weak. You were degenerate. This was tied up in classism too. The wealthy could afford medical treatments for their children's moral failings. The poor, they were labelled as naturally impure, their desires just another symptom of their unworthiness. Historians still argue over the motivations behind this panic. Some see it as a backlash to industrialisation. Machines were replacing bodies, and that displacement turned inward, leading people to obsess over controlling what little they still owned, themselves. Others view it as a reaction to growing secularism and scientific advancement. The more society moved away from divine explanation, the more it needed new tools, like medicine and psychology, to enforce moral norms. There's even a theory that this was a cultural response to guilt over colonialism. While the empire plundered the world, the English middle class retreated into imagined purity at home, desperate to believe they were righteous in some way. Let's add a strange fringe fact into this mess. In the 1870s, one enterprising moralist named Sylvester Graham, yes, the guy behind Graham Crackers, promoted bland food as a way to reduce sexual urges. He believed spicy or flavourful meals overstimulated the body and led to, you guessed it, self-abuse. So he encouraged a diet of plain bread, unseasoned vegetables, and of course his signature crackers. His followers created entire meal plans to neutralise libido. If you have ever wondered why some Victorian dishes taste like boiled regret, it wasn't by accident. This entire cultural obsession with self-denial didn't go unnoticed by the quietly rebellious. Secret books circulated through elite social clubs. Erotic poetry was whispered at dinner parties, smuggled in leather-bound journals. Even some doctors privately expressed doubt, admitting in hushed tones that perhaps all this bad habit panic was less science and more superstition dressed in a lab coat. But publicly, they towed the line. No one wanted to be the one to say, actually, it's probably fine. And so an entire generation grew up terrified of their own skin. The body became a war zone, desire an enemy within. Nighttime was not for dreaming, it was for guilt, shame, and the gnawing fear that your thoughts might betray you before you even moved. You weren't just policing your actions, you were expected to master your imagination. By the time you drift through a Victorian hospital's mental ward, you're not surprised to find entire wings devoted to masturbatory insanity. Patients are locked away for being unable to suppress what is, fundamentally normal, human instinct. The tragedy? No one talks about the emotional damage of being told you're broken for feeling. That damage lives in silence, in withdrawn glances, clenched fists, and the exhaustion of pretending you're always in control. But even here, repression breeds its opposite. You catch whispers among the nurses, rumours of books hidden under floorboards, drawings tucked in coat linings. Even in the asylum, the spark of defiance flickers, because as much as they tried, the Victorians never truly killed desire. They just made it afraid of itself. You're back in the drawing room, perched awkwardly on a settee, upholstered in something that crunches faintly when you shift. It's 1863, and you're 10 years old. No one has explained where babies come from, why you're suddenly sprouting hair in places you didn't have before, or why your body has started feeling like it's conspiring against you. What you do know is that asking questions about any of it results in uncomfortable silences, whispered reprimands, or possibly a long, grim talk about the virtues of modesty. Welcome to sex education Victorian style, where the less you know, the better, and shame is considered a more effective teaching tool than science. You begin to notice how adults speak in riddles. Everything is softened into euphemism, draped in metaphor, or shrouded in biblical allegory. Instead of learning about menstruation, young girls are told that their monthly visitor is arriving. Boys are warned to avoid impure thoughts, but aren't told what those thoughts might entail. No one uses the word sex unless they're referring to gender, and even then, it's said with a kind of hushed reverence, as though the syllables themselves might catch fire. One day, you're handed a little booklet, probably the laws of life and health, or something equally sanctimonious, and it tells you that Self-abuse is a downward spiral into idiocy, moral decay, and possibly scrofula. It doesn't explain what self-abuse actually is, of course, so you assume it means thinking about your crush while eating a pear tart. The ambiguity is the point. The vagueness gives adults cover while still allowing them to pretend they've done their duty. It's a strategic silence designed not to inform, but to inhibit. And then there are the purity lectures. Travelling speakers show up in schoolrooms and town halls to scare you straight, literally. You sit rigidly on a hard wooden bench while a red-faced man in a waistcoat rants about the dangers of vice. He waves around diagrams that look like crime scene sketches and refers to female anatomy as that which must remain unspoken. You leave with more questions than answers and a newfound fear of walking past mirror shops in case you catch a glimpse of yourself and ignite a moral crisis. For girls, the messaging is even more contradictory. You're supposed to be innocent, yet somehow prepared for marriage. Pure, yet fertile. Uninformed, yet modestly wise. When your body changes, no one explains it. Maybe your mother passes along a vague warning, "You're a woman now, so you must be careful." Careful of what? You don't know. There's no discussion of consent, desire, or anatomy. Only warnings cloaked in myth. The idea is that ignorance will protect you, that not knowing will keep you pure. But all it does is create confusion, fear, and a gnawing sense that something is always wrong with you. Parents, for the most part, don't want to talk about it. And honestly, can you blame them? They weren't taught anything either. Most Victorian mothers never received formal sexual education. They learned from whispers, older sisters, or not at all. Fathers relied on schoolmasters or pamphlets, then hoped for the best. There were no birds and the bees talks, just vague instructions to behave with propriety, and, if you were lucky, a stack of scripture to consult when curiosity struck. Sometimes religious institutions picked up the slack, but with the delicacy of a hammer. You'd hear sermons about the sins of the flesh, delivered in furious tones by clergymen who clearly had a few things they weren't confessing. The Bible was mined for metaphors that sounded holy, but felt terrifying. Hellfire, temptation, original sin, it all made puberty feel like the first step toward eternal damnation. If your hand wandered under the covers at night, you'd better hope your soul didn't wander with it. The fringe fact here, some families tried to explain reproduction using botany, like actual flowers. The idea was that if you could understand the stamen and pistil, you could maybe make the leap to human anatomy without anyone saying anything scandalous. This led to some truly baffling analogies and more than a few children believing that pregnancy occurred when women simply sat near heavily pollinated plants. In one infamous case, a governess tried to explain menstruation using the life cycle of a daffodil. The result? A child bursting into tears during spring gardening season, convinced her organs were blooming inside her. This ignorance wasn't benign, it was tactical. Victorian society believed that knowledge encouraged temptation. Better to leave young people uninformed, so they might stumble less. The flaw, of course, is obvious. Curiosity doesn't disappear when you ignore it. It festers, it transforms into shame, misinformation, and sometimes dangerous decisions. Girls married without understanding what a wedding night entailed. Boys entered brothels expecting romance and found brutality. And when questions were asked, they were often met with silence or punishment. You overhear two boys whispering in the schoolyard. One claims that babies are made when two people fall asleep beside each other while holding hands. Another insists a special marriage doctor comes to your house and sprinkles fertility powder. A third, clearly the most worldly, says he saw a painting in a French magazine once and now understands everything. He's 12. They all nod solemnly. This lack of information stretches into adulthood. Married couples often don't know how to be intimate. Women suffer in silence, assuming their discomfort is normal. Men confuse dominance for passion. Doctors sometimes tell women that marital relations should be endured, not enjoyed. The emotional disconnect is profound. You're supposed to build a life with someone you're not even allowed to look at naked without blushing through your skull. Scholars still debate the long-term impact of this cultural silence. Some argue it created a kind of psychological schism, a division between public behaviour and private thought that defined an entire generation. Others suggest it gave birth to the modern obsession with sexual secrecy and performance. In either case, the emotional cost is steep. Repression doesn't protect, it isolates, and ignorance, far from preserving innocence, just leaves you vulnerable in more dangerous ways. By the time you reach your late teens, you've probably figured some things out. Maybe through trial and error, maybe through scandal, but not through guidance, not through honest conversation. Your education in intimacy has been a scavenger hunt through shame and rumour. And if you're lucky, you've only absorbed half the guilt that was thrown your way. You sit at a dinner party, now a young adult. Someone makes a veiled joke about a lady's slipper, and the table explodes in awkward laughter. No one explains the punchline. You just laugh along, pretending to understand while silently cataloguing yet another euphemism in the never-ending glossary of things you're not supposed to name. You're standing at the edge of a Victorian bridal suite, watching as a nervous young woman steps over the threshold in her wedding gown, trailing lace and confusion. She's been told this is the happiest day of her life. She's been told that marriage is sacred, that love is pure, and that tonight something important is going to happen, though no one has dared explain what. The candles are flickering, her new husband is awkwardly clearing his throat, and somewhere deep in her chest there's a rising sense of dread wrapped in satin ribbons. Welcome to the Cult of Virginity, where a woman's entire worth can be measured by whether or not she bleeds on the right night. Victorian society doesn't just value virginity, it worships it. Purity is the currency women trade for status, security, and the vague hope of not being entirely miserable in a socially sanctioned partnership. And it's not just about biology, it's about symbolism. Virginity becomes shorthand for obedience, piety, innocence, and most importantly, ownership. A virgin bride is a pristine object, a sealed envelope being handed from one man, her father, to another, her husband. What she feels, not exactly the point. You watch her on her wedding night, shaking hands, unclasping buttons she didn't know were relevant until now. If she's lucky, her new husband is gentle. If she's not, he's impatient and angry that she didn't arrive with a user manual. But regardless of how the night unfolds, the next morning will include the check. Yes, that check. Someone, usually a mother-in-law, a maid, or an older female relative, will inspect the sheets for a bloodstain. Proof of virginity. Proof of virtue. Proof that the transaction was pure. If there's no blood, well then things get complicated. Maybe she's accused of deceit. Maybe the marriage is quietly annulled. Maybe her husband treats her with cold suspicion for the rest of her life. Never mind that not all women bleed during first intercourse. That detail is swept under the rug along with a lot of other inconvenient truths. In the Cult of Virginity, evidence is everything. Pain is expected, and women are told that their suffering is simply the price of respect. And here's where it gets even weirder. The virgin ideal doesn't disappear after marriage. A wife is supposed to be pure before the wedding, and basically uninterested afterward. She's meant to provide children, yes, but not to enjoy herself. Pleasure is viewed as a male prerogative. A woman who seeks it is suspicious. A woman who talks about it, dangerous. So even in marriage she is encouraged to be passive, silent and chaste. The ideal woman isn't just a virgin once, she's a virgin forever, even as she births 9 children and runs a household. This creates a paradox so exhausting it could be a yoga pose. You must be desirable enough to attract a husband, but innocent enough to not understand what he's attracted to. You must bear children, but never initiate intimacy. You must be the angel of the home, but never betray that you have a body underneath your dress. Your sexuality is expected to exist only in service to someone else, and even then, it's not really yours. Of course, there's a fringe market for managing all this. Enter the shady business of virginity restoration. That's right. Victorian entrepreneurs weren't about to let biology stand in the way of a good wedding. You could buy blood capsules to fake the post-wedding proof. There were even quasi-surgical procedures that promised to recreate the hymen, though many were glorified scams or borderline torture. But desperate women paid, often in secret, just to avoid the fallout of suspicion. For the truly anxious, there were also instruction manuals, bizarre little booklets that claimed to prepare young brides for what lay ahead. Most were vague at best, misleading at worst. A typical passage might advise the new wife to submit with grace to her husband's needs and bear discomfort as part of her divine calling. Translation: grin and bear it. If you feel pain, that's normal. If you feel nothing, that's fine. If you feel desire, don't. Men, on the other hand, are expected to be experienced. Not explicitly, of course. Victorian etiquette says everyone's supposed to act like they don't know what they're doing, but let's be honest, society makes room for the double standard. A man who sows wild oats before marriage is just being a man. A woman who does the same is ruined. Male sexual experiences are winked at inevitability. Female experience is a moral crisis. So naturally, many men visit brothels long before they propose. It's a dirty secret that everyone sort of knows and no one acknowledges. This duality, angelic wives and available mistresses, is baked into the very structure of Victorian society. It's like a romantic comedy where the lead actress has to play both roles, but gets punished if anyone finds out she's acting. Scholars still wrestle with the contradictions of Victorian virginity. Was it a sincere moral belief, or just a way to maintain patriarchal control? Some argue that this obsession with purity was an attempt to stabilise a society on the edge of rapid industrial and social change. When the economy is shifting and the empire's growing, you need anchors, and women's bodies made very convenient ones. Others point out how economic security was directly tied to female chastity. A ruined reputation didn't just mean scandal, it meant poverty, exile, and the loss of any chance at a stable future. One particularly bleak detail: women accused of losing their virginity outside marriage were often sent away. Gone to the country became code for pregnancies that had to be hidden. Sometimes the baby was adopted in secret. Other times the child disappeared entirely. And the woman? Her name was scrubbed from family letters. Her shame became a cautionary tale whispered to younger siblings. A single mistake, and she was cast out like a ghost. But not everyone played by the rules. Diaries from the era, especially those kept hidden in drawers or tucked between the pages of prayer books, tell a different story. Women did feel desire, some even enjoyed sex, but these thoughts were buried in metaphors, shrouded in guilt, and rarely spoken aloud. The rare woman who dared to say what she felt, writers like Mary Wollstonecraft or George Eliot, was branded eccentric, dangerous, or worse, and yet they wrote anyway. In the flicker of candlelight, the young bride lies awake beside her sleeping husband, unsure if she did something wrong or everything right. No one told her what to expect. No one gave her the words. All she knows is that her life has changed, and she's not sure if that change is liberation or a new kind of captivity. Somewhere in the distance, a clock chimes midnight. A new day has begun, but she's still waiting for someone to explain what just happened. It's a rainy afternoon, and you find yourself in the tiled foyer of a private London clinic. The smell of coal smoke clings to your coat, but inside it's all polished brass fixtures, white linen, and the soft clink of glass jars being moved by gloved hands. A pale young woman in a bonnet sits nervously in the waiting room, wringing her handkerchief. Her eyes dart around like she's afraid of being recognised. She's here because something feels wrong. Tightness in her chest, mood swings, strange dreams she can't quite talk about. The doctor will soon diagnose her with hysteria, and that's where things get interesting. In the Victorian era, hysteria is the catch-all diagnosis for every female ailment not easily explained, or not explained at all. The term comes from the Greek hystera, meaning uterus, because of course the root of all female issues must be womb-related. A woman with too many emotions? Hysteria. Difficulty sleeping? Hysteria. Rebellious behaviour? Hysteria. Daydreaming too much, crying for no reason, feeling anything? Hysteria, hysteria, hysteria. Is a medical label so elastic it can stretch over just about any problem without actually addressing the cause? And for Victorian doctors, that's the appeal. Rather than investigate mental health, social repression or trauma, they simply say, "Ah yes, her uterus is acting up again," and prescribe a solution that ranges from bed rest to water therapy to, yes, genital massage. That's not a euphemism. That's literally what they did. You sit there blinking at the treatment notes while the doctor, entirely straight-faced, explains that bringing the patient to hysterical paroxysm will relieve her symptoms. It's one of the strangest open secrets of the era, that Victorian medicine essentially invented the vibrator as a labour-saving device. Doctors were apparently getting wrist cramps from manually treating patients with hysteria, so they developed vibrating machinery to do the job faster and more efficiently. One early prototype is powered by steam. Another looks like a sewing machine had a scandalous one-night stand with a dentist's drill, but they were marketed as purely clinical instruments. For the nervous woman, not the sensual one. Definitely not for pleasure. Don't be ridiculous, that would be improper. So now you've got dozens, maybe hundreds of women across England being treated for hysteria by doctors who genuinely believe they are curing a disease, while never acknowledging that what's really happening is, well, an orgasm. Victorian medical textbooks call it relief or nervous release. But the language is so sanitised, so thick with denial, that no one has to admit the truth. Women's bodies feel things, and sometimes, brace yourself, they even have to want things. It's like an entire country is playing a game of Taboo with its own anatomy. But hysteria isn't just about sex, it's also about control. Diagnosing a woman with hysteria is a way to delegitimise her voice. If she's angry, she must be irrational. If she's depressed, she's just being delicate. If she questions her marriage, her role, or the status quo, she's clearly unwell. Hysteria becomes a tool of social obedience, a velvet cage lined with lace. You can be sent away to a sanatorium, confined to bed, or declared legally incompetent. All it takes is a letter from a concerned husband or father, and there's no appeal. Once labelled, you are discredited. This leads to some truly dystopian situations. Imagine a woman, educated, outspoken, perhaps even politically minded. She starts giving lectures on women's suffrage. People call her overwrought. Her family consults a doctor. He diagnoses hysteria. Suddenly she's institutionalised for exhaustion. It's medicalised gaslighting with a stethoscope. And once you're in the asylum, getting out is a different matter entirely. There's a chilling fringe case involving a woman named Louisa Lowe, who was locked up in the 1870s after speaking too passionately in public about religious freedom. Her diagnosis? Religious mania, a form of hysteria. She spent months trying to prove she was sane, all while surrounded by doctors who believed that sanity and submission were the same thing. Eventually, she was released and wrote scathing accounts of her treatment, but the damage was done. Her reputation was tarnished, her credibility shredded by diagnosis. Even among the elite, hysteria weaves its fingers into daily life. You're at a dinner party. A woman stands too quickly and excuses herself. "Oh, poor thing," someone murmurs. "She's terribly nervous." Another woman confesses to migraines that last days. She's advised to take to bed and avoid reading novels. "Too much fiction inflames the mind," says a guest with absolute sincerity. You sip your tea and try not to scream into your crumpet. And here's the wildest part. The men diagnosing hysteria were often dealing with their own unspoken emotional spirals. But they didn't have a convenient umbrella term. Male anxiety was cloaked in terms like neurasthenia or overwork, viewed as the noble burden of being rational and industrious. Women got hysteria, men got medals for struggling. It's the same feelings, filtered through a gendered lens that turned one into a condition and the other into character. Historians still argue whether Victorian doctors were completely oblivious or just incredibly good at denial. Did they know what they were doing when they brought women to paroxysm? Did they truly believe the uterus wandered around the body like a lost balloon, causing madness wherever it went? Some scholars think the entire concept of hysteria was a kind of mass psychosis, not of the patients but of the culture. Others say it was a cynical tool to suppress rebellion under the guise of medicine. Either way, it's clear the hysteria diagnosis says more about Victorian fear than Victorian science. Because at its core, hysteria is about what happens when people aren't allowed to express what they feel. When society decides that emotion itself is a threat. It's not just women who suffer. It's everyone living in a system that punishes vulnerability, silences curiosity, and wraps control in the language of care. You leave the clinic and walk into the rain, your boots clicking on the wet stone. Behind you, the waiting room fills with new patients, each carrying their own quiet grief. Some will be soothed, others will be silenced. But all of them are haunted by the same question. What if the real illness isn't in them at all? What if it's in the world that refuses to listen? You're now walking through the halls of a grand Victorian manor, the kind with ceilings high enough to echo and rugs so plush you sink in slightly with each step. But you're not here to admire the wallpaper, or the ancestral portraits glaring disapprovingly from above the fireplace. No, you're here to take a closer look at the fashion choices of the day, specifically what's happening to the women swishing through the rooms in gowns so structured they need assistance just to sit down. Tonight, we're slipping into corsets, navigating crinolines, and exploring how Victorian fashion became one of the most elaborate and suffocating forms of control ever invented. The corset is the star of this drama, of course. Boned, laced, and usually constructed from stiff materials like whalebone or steel. It isn't just a garment, it's a physical contract. A truce between the body and society that says, "I will compress myself to fit your ideals." I will reshape my natural form into a cartoon hourglass, because anything less is uncivilized. The average fashionable woman might have her waist cinched down to 18 or even 16 inches. That's smaller than a modern throw pillow. Breathing, optional. Eating, laughably optimistic. You watch as a maid helps her mistress dress for the evening. It's a team sport. First a chemise, then the corset laced tightly at the back while the woman holds onto a bedpost gritting her teeth. Then come the petticoats, layer upon layer of fabric, and finally the full, the gown itself, often with bustles or crinolines to create exaggerated hip structures. The result? A silhouette straight out of a fashion plate and a spine straight out of a horror novel. The crinoline in particular is a magnificent beast. Basically a giant cage worn under the skirt, it holds the fabric outward in a bell shape so wide you could use it to host a small tea party under there. It's heavy, awkward, and frequently dangerous. Women caught their skirts on fire just trying to walk too close to a fireplace. Others were blown into lakes or knocked unconscious when trying to board carriages. There's at least one documented case of a woman's crinoline collapsing in a crowd, trapping several people under her skirts. So yeah, chic but with a body count. But it's not just about inconvenience. These clothes are about discipline. They train you to be still. You can't move freely, you can't slouch, you can't sprawl, leap, or even climb stairs without planning ahead. And this enforced stillness is not incidental. It's part of how Victorian femininity is defined. A proper woman doesn't take up space. She floats, glides, hovers at the edges. Her movements are ornamental. Her silence, even physical silence, is a mark of refinement. And yet this clothing is also armour. In a society that judges women harshly for every visible curve or twitch of desire, layers of fabric are protection. Corsets hide breasts and rib cages, flatten stomachs, and erase any sign that a woman might say, breathe irregularly around someone attractive. Skirts create distance. Gloves shield the hands from too much exposure. Even the hair is tightly pinned and managed, often covered with bonnets or veils. The body is not something to be engaged with. It is something to be obscured and sculpted. Now here's the fringe fact. Some feminists of the era actually liked corsets. Not all, but a few. Their argument? That the corset gave women posture and presence, especially in public spaces, where they weren't otherwise welcomed. A corset could be a kind of shield, something that held you together in a world that wanted you to fall apart. Some even claimed that corsets helped them concentrate, that the tightness produced a mental discipline. Of course, this may also have been the oxygen deprivation talking, but the debate remains. Meanwhile, men are dressing with their own code of discomfort. Tight collars, long wool coats, tall hats that must be doffed just right. The Victorian gentleman must appear composed at all times, with no sweat stains, no crooked ties, and certainly no visible signs of lust or vulnerability. Fashion becomes a language of repression for both aggressive genders. If your clothing doesn't pinch, suffocate, or chafe a little, you're probably doing something immoral. You pass through a department store where mannequins wear all the latest designs. Catalogues promise that the ideal figure can be achieved with the right corset and moral dedication. Women with naturally curvier bodies are told to lace tighter. Those who can't conform are offered correctional garments and scolded gently for their excess. The message is clear. Your body isn't yours. It's a project, a sculpted monument to someone else's aesthetic. This extends even to pregnancy, which Victorians don't really want to acknowledge happens, despite the evidence of multiple children. Maternity wear exists, but it's discreet to the point of invisibility. Women are expected to remain stylish, composed, and publicly unpregnant until the very end. When the belly can no longer be hidden, many retreat from social life altogether, as though to protect the illusion that storks, not biology, are responsible for reproduction. And here's a scholarly debate worth chewing on. Did women accept these fashions because they believed in them, or because they had no other choice? Some historians argue that women used fashion to express status, personality, and even rebellion, wearing colours, fabrics, or tailoring that pushed boundaries in subtle ways. Others suggest these garments were tools of social control, carefully designed to keep women passive, uncomfortable, and dependent on assistance. The truth probably lies somewhere in between. Like most things Victorian, it's complicated. You pause in front of a mirror, imagining yourself in full Victorian dress. The weight of the crinoline, the tightness of the corset, the layers of silk, wool and lace, You can't breathe deeply, you can't run, you can't slouch, but you do look stunning, by the era's standards. A walking symbol of decorum and denial. And yet behind closed doors, corsets are unlaced, bustles are removed, breath returns to the lungs. A different kind of woman might emerge, one with opinions, with wants, with stretch marks and sighs, but in public she remains the silhouette, the outline of an idea carefully stitched and silently enduring. You step out of the manor and into the damp London air, skirts rustling, like whispered secrets. A man passes you, hat tipped politely. He sees the fashion, not the person, the shape, not the soul, but you know what's underneath. And so does she. It's just after midnight, and you're walking down a cobblestone alley in Victorian London. The gas lamps flicker overhead, casting long, slanted shadows across the walls of shuttered shops and fog-drenched corners. Somewhere in the distance a carriage clatters over the stones, wheels echoing like a heartbeat, and just ahead you see him, a well-dressed gentleman, coat pressed, hat tipped at a careful angle. He glances over his shoulder, checks that no one is watching, then disappears behind a red door marked with nothing but a number. You follow, of course. Tonight, we're exploring the gentleman's double life, the moral angel by day, the ravenous shadow after dark. In Victorian England, hypocrisy isn't just a habit, it's an art form. The ideal man is expected to be upright, moral, restrained. He is a provider, a protector, a pillar of society. He speaks of duty and decency and church attendance. But after sundown, a different creature emerges. The same men who sponsor purity lectures or legislate public decency are often the ones frequenting brothels, seducing housemaids, or collecting explicit French engravings imported under fake book covers. The two lives don't just coexist, they depend on each other. Marriage, for many upper and middle class men, is about social expectation, not passion. A wife is chosen for her purity, her family standing, her quietness. She becomes the mother of his children, the hostess of his dinners, the manager of his domestic empire. But intimacy, that's often outsourced. There's a tacit understanding, one no one speaks aloud but everyone knows, that true male desire must be channeled elsewhere. It's not respectable to be too attracted to your wife. That might imply she's not pure, and we can't have that. You find yourself in a club tucked behind the facade of a bookstore. Inside, the curtains are velvet, the cigars are hand-rolled, and the conversation is far more colourful than anything discussed at breakfast. Here, men joke freely about their escapades, share addresses of favoured ladies, and toast to pleasures never mentioned in public. They are relaxed in a way they never are around their families. And it's not just about sex, it's about freedom. To feel, to desire, to be crass, silly, even emotional. Things not permitted in the daylight version of themselves. And yes, many of them have mistresses, some long-term, treated almost like secondary wives. These women live in apartments paid for by their benefactors, kept in relative comfort so long as they remain discreet. Others are performers, actresses, dancers or singers whose charms extend beyond the stage. These relationships are well known among certain circles and tolerated so long as no scandal erupts. The illusion of morality must be preserved, even if everyone is in on the farce. The fringe fact: even major political figures kept mistresses or frequented sex workers while publicly preaching virtue. One member of parliament known for pushing through laws on public morality was caught in a compromising position with a courtesan, and still somehow managed to defend his behaviour as the moment of moral weakness. His punishment? A quiet retirement and a generous pension. A woman caught in a similar scandal would be ruined, ostracised, unemployed, and possibly imprisoned under the same laws he wrote. And then there's the housemaid situation. In many upper-class homes, young women were brought in from the countryside to work long hours for low wages, living under the same roof as the master of the house. It's no coincidence that many of them ended up pregnant, victims of subtle coercion, unspoken expectation, or outright assault. These young women couldn't accuse their employers without risking their livelihoods, and even if they did, no one would believe them. They were dismissed quietly, labelled fallen, and left to fend for themselves. The men, untouched. It's a haunting dynamic, men living double lives because they can, while women live singular lives that are judged from every angle. And society enables this, even celebrates it, in coded ways. Literature of the time reflects the divide. The fallen woman is a tragic figure. the prostitute with a heart of gold who must die to redeem herself. The angelic wife is praised for her patience and silence. And the man, he gets to be both sinner and saint, forgiven before he even sins. Scholars argue whether these double lives were truly invisible to the public or simply ignored. Some say everyone knew, but no one wanted to burst the bubble of middle-class morality. Others suggest that the separation between public and private morality was so strong that people genuinely didn't connect the dots. It's easier to pretend than confront the truth, that virtue was often just a costume, and behind it people were as messy and complex as ever. And the cultural institutions backed this charade. Churches preached forgiveness for men, the legal system protected property and reputation, again for men, and literature romanticised the struggle of the noble gentleman torn between desire and duty, as though the real tragedy was his guilt, not the wreckage he left behind. But cracks began to show. Investigative journalists started poking into the red light districts. Reformers exposed the conditions of the working class women being used and discarded by these respectable men. The hypocrisy became harder to ignore. Some men were named publicly, a few even fell from grace, but for the most part, the system absorbed the scandal and kept moving. You find yourself in a cab, being driven past London's darker corners, streets with names people pretend not to recognise. Gas lamps blur in the fog. Behind drawn curtains, secrets unfold. Lives intertwine in ways never spoken of in polite conversation, and you realise this. The double life isn't just about sex, it's about power. The power to live in contradiction, to sin without consequence, to hurt without blame. The gentleman steps out of the cab and re-enters his home. He kisses his sleeping children, washes his hands, and prepares to read scripture before bed. He is respectable. He is admired. And he is never, ever asked about where he's been. It's early morning, and you're standing near Covent Garden as the city begins to stir. Horse hooves click against the stone, vendors shout about their fish and flowers, and chimney smoke curls lazily into the hazy sky. But beneath this normal bustle is another rhythm, one that rarely appears in census reports or family memoirs. You're about to walk into the part of Victorian life everyone knew about, but pretended didn't exist. Prostitution, or as the newspapers so delicately called it, the social evil. Despite all their pearl-clutching and prayer meetings, Victorians lived in a world where sex work was everywhere. Brothels operated behind lace curtains and discreet entrances. Streets like Holywell and Vine Street were infamous. And even though the moral authorities declared public war on vice, demand never faltered. In fact, London had thousands, yes, thousands of sex workers operating at any given time, ranging from luxurious courtesans to struggling girls barely into their teens. It's not a fringe issue. It's a major artery in the body of Victorian society. You pause on a corner where a young woman leans against a lamppost, eyes rimmed with coal corsets slightly askew. She's no older than 17. You don't know her name, neither do her clients. But her presence is accepted, almost institutionalised. Men in top hats pass her without shame. Policemen look the other way, especially if they've already had their favour for the week. And just around the block, another girl watches the street nervously, hoping for enough coins to afford a meal that isn't crusts and tea. This isn't just desperation, it's survival. Many women turned to sex work because their options were limited. If you were orphaned, dismissed from domestic service, or simply poor, there were few paths to economic stability. Factories paid pennies, sweatshops worked you to the bone. Charitable homes might take you in, but only if you repented hard enough and never spoke again of what had driven you there. Prostitution, grim as it was, offered immediate money, and for some, a tiny thread of independence. But society didn't see it that way. The stigma was brutal. Sex workers were labelled as fallen women, assumed to be moral failures who had given in to base instincts. Never mind that many had been coerced, trafficked or abused. The language of the time stripped them of humanity. They weren't women. They were creatures of vice, disease vectors, urban blights. And yet, men kept coming. One of the most bizarre aspects of this double standard was the belief that men needed access to sex workers for their health. You heard that right. Victorian medical experts actually claimed that young men had to release tension to maintain their well-being. A common justification went like this: it's better for a man to satisfy his desires in a controlled environment than risk seducing, or worse, marrying an upper-class woman and contaminating the family line with his wicked urges. So the working class girls were offered up like sacrifices, their suffering chalked up to necessary losses in the maintenance of social order. In the 1860s, the government tried to get a handle on this so-called problem with the Contagious Diseases Acts. These laws allowed police to arrest women suspected of being prostitutes and force them into invasive medical exams to check for venereal disease. And by suspected, they meant any woman who looked poor, stood alone too long, or had ever once been associated with immoral areas. There was no due process, no appeals. If you refused the exam, you could be imprisoned. If you submitted and were found infected, you'd be locked away in a hospital until deemed clean. Notice what's missing here. Men. They were never examined, never detained, never even questioned. The assumption was that women spread disease and the men simply caught it. This staggering imbalance of blame turned public health into a weapon of shame. And for the women, the label of unclean stuck long after the infection cleared. Of course, there was backlash. Enter Josephine Butler, a fierce, tireless activist who fought to repeal the acts and defend the rights of these women. She marched, protested, and endured personal attacks for speaking openly about sex, disease, and the moral rot at the heart of the legislation. She called out the hypocrisy of a society that punished women while protecting the very men who used and discarded them. Her campaign was long, grueling, and often mocked, but it eventually succeeded. The Contagious Diseases Acts were repealed. The damage, however, was already done. You walk past a newspaper vendor shouting headlines, "Vice in the East End, the decline of morality." The papers love a scandal, especially if it involves women. A high-profile case of a murdered prostitute makes front-page news, not because the woman's life matters, but because the gory details titillate readers who pretend to be shocked. Even Jack the Ripper, who would terrorise Whitechapel decades later, was often portrayed not as a predator, but as a symbol of the moral filth he was cleansing. That's how twisted the narrative had become. And here's your fringe detail for the day. Brothels near Parliament were so popular that one enterprising madam offered discounted lunchtime rates for civil servants. She even kept a cloakroom for members of Parliament's top hats so they wouldn't be seen entering with recognisable attire. Discretion was the real luxury. Academics continue to debate whether Victorian prostitution was more exploitative or transactional. Some historians argue that sex work gave certain women more autonomy than domestic service or marriage ever could. Others insist that the inherent dangers, violence, disease, social ruin, made it one of the bleakest paths a woman could walk. The truth lies in its complexity. There was no single experience, no one story. But the societal message was always clear. A man's sins could be forgiven. A woman's could not, even if she sinned for food, even if she sinned under threat, even if she was never really given a choice. You pause at a window where a woman leans out from a dimly lit room, watching the street below. Her eyes meet yours. There's no seduction in her gaze, just weariness. You nod. She nods back. You both know the game, and you both know who never has to play by the rules. It's a soft, cloudy evening, and you're now seated in a modest sitting room. Fire gently crackling, the wallpaper floral, the atmosphere deceptively cosy. Across from you is a newly married Victorian woman. Her hands are folded in her lap, her wedding band glinting faintly in the firelight. She's smiling the way women are expected to. Pleasant, restrained, slightly tired. But there's a heaviness in her eyes. She's been married for 3 weeks now, and what she's learned in those 21 days has filled her with questions she's not allowed to ask. Tonight, you're inside the quiet tragedy of marital sex in Victorian England, where pleasure is taboo, consent is vague, and desire is something no one dares name. You would think marriage would be the one place where intimacy is permitted. After all, the whole point of the institution, at least according to the lectures and etiquette books, is to provide a moral space for physical union. But the reality, it's bleak. Most women enter marriage with no understanding of sex, no language for their experiences, and no authority over their own bodies. And once the ceremony ends, the expectation is simple. Submit. Legally, consent doesn't exist within marriage. Under Victorian law, a husband has the right to sexual access to his wife at any time. The very concept of marital rape doesn't exist, not because it's accepted, but because it's not acknowledged as a thing that can happen. A wife, once legally bound, is considered part of her husband's household. Her body, included in the furniture more or less. She has no legal autonomy, no personal privacy, and no social support if she tries to resist. If she says no, she's not just disobedient, she's ungrateful, hysterical, or defective. You sit with her as she tries to make sense of it all. The wedding night was a blur of confusion and discomfort. Her mother told her it would be her duty, but didn't explain what that duty involved. Her husband was not cruel exactly, just impatient and entitled. He expected compliance, not understanding. Since then, she's endured each night as something to get through. She prays silently for headaches. She wakes early to avoid lingering in bed. And every time she flinches or pulls away, he reminds her that it's his right. And here's the double bind. If she shows interest, if she seems to enjoy it, she risks being labelled unnatural, even wanton. A good Victorian wife isn't supposed to desire. She's supposed to endure. Any sign of enthusiasm could make her suspect tainted. This makes her body a battlefield between expectations, ignorance, and the simple human need for safety. Doctors, of course, are no help. They tell her that women are naturally less sexual, that her lack of desire is normal and proper. They advise her to focus on motherhood, to keep her thoughts pure, and to avoid too much fiction. If she's experiencing pain, that's part of the process. If she's feeling empty afterward, well, at least her husband is satisfied. One medical manual actually advises women to think of their husband's pleasure as a service akin to housekeeping, just slightly more private. You blink, she blinks, the room is suddenly colder. Meanwhile, her husband has no one telling him to exercise restraint. On the contrary, he's been told since his teen years that it's dangerous to suppress sexual urges for too long. He believes this is what marriage is for, to have access, without shame, without sin. And perhaps in some part of him he wonders why she seems distant. But he doesn't ask. That would require acknowledging something is off. It's easier to assume she's just delicate, or prudish, or tired. Victorian men are taught to be protectors of virtue, but no one explains how that virtue might look like suffering. And here's your fringe fact. A widely circulated marriage manual from the 1850s warned women that if they didn't submit cheerfully to their husband's advances, he might be driven to seek pleasure elsewhere, and it would be her fault. Infidelity was framed not as a moral failing of the man, but as a natural response to female coldness. So not only is she expected to comply, she must also do so with enough warmth to prevent betrayal, but not so much that she appears lustful. It's emotional gymnastics with a moving finish line. She's not alone in her confusion. You read between the lines in women's letters to one another. Phrases like the ordeal or the sacrifice appear again and again. Some women find ways to shut themselves down, others dissociate entirely. A few rebel quietly, refusing to sleep in the same room, claiming illness, fleeing to religious fervour as a socially acceptable excuse for physical withdrawal. And then there are those who endure decade after decade under the weight of a duty that no one ever explained, but everyone insists must be fulfilled. Academics continue to debate how widespread this misery was. Some argue that many Victorian marriages were affectionate, even warm, within the limits of the time. Others highlight the staggering levels of emotional and physical disconnect baked into the institution. What's clear is that the system was designed to silence discomfort, to make suffering invisible, and to mask absence of consent as a form of devotion. You walk through a quiet neighbourhood, past rows of townhouses, each one containing a version of the same story. Behind those lace curtains, polite breakfasts, carefully prepared children, and bedrooms that echo with silence. You pass a bookstore selling novels with sanitised love stories. The heroines are always pure, the heroes always patient. No one speaks of confusion, no one bleeds. It's all too tidy, too false. You stop in front of a church where a newlywed couple steps out showered in rose petals. They're smiling for the crowd, for the community, for the story they've been told since childhood. But as they drive off in their carriage, you can't help but wonder, did anyone tell her what to expect? Does she even know what her rights aren't? Or will she lie in bed tonight, staring at the ceiling, praying that confusion doesn't mean failure? The fire in the sitting room has burned low. The woman you sat with earlier adjusts her shawl and says nothing. But you can see it in her posture, in the way she moves. Something is breaking. Quietly, carefully, so it won't make a sound. It's a crisp autumn afternoon, and you're in a parlour surrounded by soft pastels, embroidery hoops, and a slightly oppressive number of floral teacups. At the centre of it all sits the Victorian ideal. the angel in the house. She's reading poetry aloud, or maybe arranging roses with serene precision. Her hair is smooth, her posture upright, her face composed in that tight-lipped smile that says, "I have never once had a personal thought." Tonight, you're spending time with the woman every Victorian man was told to marry, and every Victorian woman was told to become. This angel isn't just a trope, she's a cultural mandate. Coined from the 1854 poem by Coventry Patmore, the angel in the house became both metaphor and instruction manual. She is the perfect wife, gentle, submissive, morally pure, self-sacrificing, and so consistently cheerful that you start to worry about how much laudanum is in her tea. Her entire identity is built around service, first to her father, then to her husband, and finally to her children. Personal ambition, emotional needs, even basic preferences, irrelevant. You watch her move through her day like a ghost in human form. She wakes early to oversee the servants, but never too early to seem industrious. She's not meant to be working, only helping. She writes a few notes for the children's governess, corrects the cook's menu with the diplomacy of a minor noble, and settles into some socially acceptable needlepoint. Her opinions are soft, her voice softer. And if her husband makes a cutting remark about her reading too many novels, she laughs lightly, as if she agrees. Her moral authority is absolute within the domestic sphere, but that sphere is tiny. She might help direct the household budget, but only if it's not too complicated. She might volunteer for charities, but only the kind that involve delivering soup to the deserving poor without making eye contact. Her religion is expected to be strong but not mystical, her politics non-existent, and her emotional expression limited to sighs and short journal entries that begin with, "I must not complain." You might think this is just for appearances, but no, this role is internalised. Women are taught from girlhood that their highest calling is to make others happy, that their own fulfilment will arrive not through achievement or desire, but through sacrifice. The more they give up, the more sacred they become. A woman who complains is selfish. A woman who desires is scandalous. A woman who wants more, dangerous. And the expectations don't stop at behaviour. Physically, she must remain ethereal. A fragile constitution is almost a requirement. She must walk delicately, faint often, and ideally suffer from at least one non-specific nervous complaint. Her appetite should be minimal, just enough to suggest she's human, not so much that anyone thinks she enjoys food. Illness is romanticised. A cough in the parlour? Tragic. A little pallor in the cheeks? Poetic. You've entered a world where the ideal woman is one breath away from a deathbed confession. But here's the quiet horror. She's also required to be the moral compass of the household. If her husband strays, it's her fault for not being angelic enough. If her children rebel, she's failed in her duty to model virtue. The world crashes down on her shoulders, and she's expected to carry it while smiling sweetly and darning socks. The fringe fact? Queen Victoria herself, yes, the woman who ruled half the globe, once referred to feminist campaigners as mad women. She fully believed in the sanctity of the domestic angel. Despite her own power, she pushed hard for the ideal that women should remain within the home, supporting their men. She adored being a wife and mother, and saw other paths for women as rebellious, even unholy. Which just adds another layer to this already confusing cake. The mother of the empire insisting women should not lead. Still, not all women accepted the halo quietly. Some chafed at the role. You see it in letters, hidden diaries, poetry passed between sisters. One woman writes, "I am tired of being good. It is very dull." Another paints in secret, using colours she's told are too bold. A third reads novels late at night under her covers, searching for characters who feel the way she does, angry, lost, hungry for something they can't name. Literature becomes one of the few safe spaces for rebellion. Jane Eyre might submit to Rochester in the end, but not before demanding to be heard. Elizabeth Bennet speaks her mind, and novels like The Awakening and The Yellow Wallpaper, though slightly later in the timeline, begin to crack the image of the obedient, smiling wife. Behind the angel's serene face is a woman slowly losing her mind. Not because she's unstable, but because the expectations are so suffocating no sane person could breathe under them. And here's the scholarly debate. Was this ideal ever truly real? Or was it always a fantasy projected by men and internalised by women out of fear and necessity? Some argue that the angel in the house was a myth built by poetry and sustained by a male-dominated culture eager to keep women out of politics, education, and power. Others suggest it was more complicated, that some women found real meaning in the role, and that criticising it too harshly erases the agency they exercise within the confines of their world. You walk through a women's reading group gathered in secret. They discuss essays on suffrage and marriage reform, always glancing over their shoulders. One reads a passage from Mary Wollstonecraft, and they all lean forward like she's revealing a spell. For a moment, the angel's wings flicker, not vanishing, but cracking, not gone, but questioned. Back in the parlour, the angel sets down her teacup and folds her hands again. She asks you if everything's all right. She always asks others that. No one asks her. You want to reach across the lace-covered table and ask her if she ever screams into a pillow. If she's ever wondered what it would feel like to walk out the front door and never come back. If she has dreams that don't involve laundry lists and dinner parties. But you know what she'll say. She'll smile and reply, "I am very happy, thank you." Because that's what angels are supposed to say. It's a foggy twilight in London, and you're standing on the edge of the city's industrial underbelly, where factory chimneys belch smoke, the air tastes like coal dust, and the streets never really sleep. This isn't the version of Victorian England that shows up on souvenir plates. This is the other side, the tangled, grimy heartbeat of urbanisation. Here, in the narrow alleys and gaslit courts, sex is not a whispered vice, it's a commodity. And tonight, you're wandering through the sins of the city, where poverty meets desire, and morality has to fight for room on the pavement. You begin in the East End, where entire families cram into tenements barely large enough for a mattress. The walls are damp, the roofs leak, and every window opens onto a chorus of shouting, coughing, and babies crying through the night. Here, privacy is a joke, and sex isn't a moral choice. It's a survival strategy. When you're living on pennies a week and bread is rationed, some people sell what they have. Bodies become both shelter and currency. The moral panic from the upper classes about this part of the city is deafening. They clutch their Bibles and opera programs while condemning the licentiousness of the poor. But they rarely consider what it means to be born into a life where the only thing you have to sell is your labour. And when that labour isn't enough, the line between work and exploitation becomes razor thin. For many women especially, poverty is not just financial, it's anatomical. You wander through a market street. Behind stalls selling rotting vegetables and counterfeit lace are houses of assignation, flats rented by the hour, offering just enough privacy for a transaction. These aren't glamorous brothels. They're worn-out rooms with thin mattresses and cracked mirrors, but they serve a purpose. And business is booming. And it's not just sex being sold, it's stories. Underground literature, crude, vivid, often handwritten, is passed hand-to-hand like contraband. It's called penny porn, a blend of illustration and imagination printed on cheap paper, designed to titillate the working classes who can't afford polished novels. Titles like The Lustful Milkmaid or The Confessions of a Governess are printed in secret and sold by newsboys who know not to make eye contact. The upper classes pretend not to know about this. Or worse, they pretend they've never read it. But many of these stories are written by men who dine in Mayfair and lecture on ethics by day. It's another Victorian paradox. The louder a man condemns obscenity, the more likely he's hiding a dog-eared pamphlet under his mattress. One magistrate was caught with a suitcase full of erotica while en route to a public morality conference. When questioned, he said it was research. Naturally. Then there are the gentlemen's clubs, hidden behind innocuous shop fronts. Unlike the polished institutions on Pall Mall, these clubs cater to darker desires, some fueled by alcohol, others by opium, many by class-based fantasies. A rich man can pay extra to dress up as a street urchin and role-play poverty. Yes, that's a real thing. One club offered a beggar's masquerade where patrons could act out being destitute while eating roasted pheasant and laughing at real poor people who were hired as props. You pass a photographer's studio offering artistic modest nudes. Officially it's for study. Unofficially it's softcore smut, sepia-toned and carefully posed to avoid legal trouble. Some women pose willingly, others are blackmailed into it. The line again is blurry, and once the photos circulate, reputations vanish. A single picture could destroy a woman's life. For the men who buy them? A chuckle, maybe a mild twinge of guilt. That's about it. One curious fringe fact. The post office had a massive problem with erotic mail. That's right. Victorians were so repressed they couldn't talk about sex in person, but couldn't stop themselves from writing about it. Love letters, dirty poems, and even homemade sketches passed through the Royal Mail in sealed envelopes marked private. Inspectors opened some, of course, and more than one postal worker was caught keeping a stash for educational purposes. One even tried to publish a collection anonymously. He was arrested within days. And all of this, the brothels, the books, the fantasies, thrives in the city because the city is anonymous. Unlike the countryside, where everyone knows your name and your laundry schedule, London offers shadows and crowds. You can be whoever you want, or no one at all. It's easy to disappear behind a gas lamp or slip into a doorway without being noticed. And that anonymity feeds the engine of urban desire. But it's not without cost. Venereal diseases run rampant, especially among the poor, who have little access to medical care and even less knowledge of prevention. Doctors' cures sold in back alleys often contain mercury, which only worsens the damage. One concoction promised to purify the blood, but mostly just cause vomiting and baldness. Women are blamed for spreading disease. Men are told they simply caught it by being too generous with their passions. And amid all this is a simmering fear that the sins of the city will somehow infect the rest of society. Reformers publish pamphlets, philanthropists open missions, and middle-class tourists take slum walks through the East End as if it's an exhibit. But few actually try to change the conditions that created the problem in the first place. They moralise, but they don't feed. They lecture, but they don't listen. Historians still argue whether the explosion of sex work and underground erotica was a product of urban poverty or simply more visible because of it. Some say the city exposed human nature. Others believe it amplified it. But either way, the urban sprawl becomes a kind of magnifying glass, showing the cracks in Victorian restraint more clearly than any salon or drawing room ever could. You walk past a building that looks abandoned but isn't. Inside, someone lights a lamp. A silhouette appears at the window watching the street. You wonder who she is. A daughter? A widow? A rebel? A woman whose choices were never really hers to begin with? The city doesn't tell you. It only hums. The door slams shut behind you with a dull thud, and suddenly you're standing in a cramped back room lit by a single gas lamp, the air thick with tobacco smoke and ink fumes. A man with smudged glasses and ink-stained fingers shuffles across the floor to shove a stack of papers into a trunk. You've just entered the underground world of Victorian pornography, and despite everything you've been told about the stiff collars and stiffer morals, the market for it is booming. Tonight we're rifling through the drawers and false-bottomed boxes of Victorian England to uncover the era's secret obsession with the obscene. You'd think a culture as obsessed with propriety as the Victorians would be squeaky clean behind closed doors. Absolutely not. In fact, the more society tried to shove sexuality into the broom closet, the more people clawed to peek through the keyhole. Hidden within bookcases, under floorboards, and between layers of harmless-looking almanacs were the real stories. Pages filled with naked bodies, lurid descriptions, forbidden acts, and desires never meant to see the light of day. Some of the earliest Victorian smut came in the form of pamphlets, cheaply printed, crudely illustrated, and often sold on street corners or under the counter in curiosity shops. Titles ranged from the vaguely poetic The Lustful Adventures of Lady Bellamy, to the wildly unsubtle The Schoolmistress Whipped, to the downright unhinged Memoirs of a Flagellated Governess. If it had a corset and some kind of cane, someone had written about it. But it wasn't all tawdry nonsense. Some of it was, well, okay, most of it was tawdry nonsense. But it also revealed a strange intimacy with the very thing society claimed to loathe. There's something deeply ironic about a culture that banned open conversations about sex while devouring erotica faster than printers could set the type. Demand was so high that entire black market presses were dedicated solely to meeting the need. Even the stiffest aristocrat might have had a small volume tucked behind the Psalms. The classic example, The Pearl, a notorious underground publication that circulated in the 1870s. Ostensibly for private circulation among gentlemen, it featured poetry, stories, and explicit illustrations. It was banned within a year, but that only made it more desirable. Like forbidden fruit wrapped in velvet, it became a collector's item among London's elite. And the content? It didn't hold back. Whipping, voyeurism, incest, cross-dressing, and more. All explored in awkwardly florid Victorian prose. It's like reading Shakespeare with a dirty mind and no editor. Some publishers got clever with camouflage. They printed erotic stories inside seemingly innocent travel journals or dictionaries. One infamous book looked like a manual on horticulture, but actually contained 100 pages of erotic engravings buried in the centre, hidden behind a glued-in section onto roses. Bookbinders were in on it too. Some offered dual binding services, sewing a racy novel into the middle of an otherwise respectable volume. So while your dinner guest thought you were reading Milton's Paradise Lost, you were actually halfway through the seductions of Miss S. And she was doing things to a footman that would cause spontaneous fainting in half of Surrey. Here's the thing, pornography wasn't just for men. Although women couldn't be seen buying it, they found ways to access it. Some read the same material through their husbands' collections. Others subscribed to romance novels that were really just erotica with better cover art. One bookseller in Bath discreetly advertised a series of health guides for ladies, which, if you had the right password, included titles like The Hidden Garden of Delight. And yes, it was about exactly what you think it was about. Victorian women were curious, imaginative, and completely done with pretending they didn't have bodies. But not everyone was amused. In fact, the moral panic over pornography grew so intense that Parliament passed the Obscene Publications Act in 1857, the first law of its kind in Britain. Its goal? To make it illegal to publish or distribute obscene material. The problem? No one could quite agree on what that meant. The definition of obscene was left vague on purpose, which allowed authorities to raid homes, arrest booksellers, and destroy publications based entirely on the personal prudery of the magistrate in charge. This led to some wild overreaches. One poor man was arrested for printing anatomical illustrations meant for the medical students. Another was fined for distributing a volume of translated French poetry, because it dared to mention thighs. The crackdown didn't really stop the flow of erotica. It just drove it deeper underground, where it thrived in private salons, artist studios, and locked drawers marked miscellaneous. Some collectors even paid extra for editions that had survived police raids, like they were buying bootleg Limcool liquor during Prohibition. Here's your fringe fact of the night. Some upper-class Victorians believed that reading erotica could cure frigidity or erectile dysfunction. Doctors? Yes, actual medical. Professionals sometimes prescribed erotic literature as a form of stimulation therapy. Of course, this advice was only given to men, and usually delivered with a wink and a whisper. For women, reading the same material might lead to a diagnosis of hysteria or degeneracy, because naturally, what heals one gender apparently corrupts the other. And the hypocrisy didn't end there. While high society condemned the poor for moral filth, they privately consumed the same filth in imported editions printed on expensive paper. While women were scolded for wearing revealing dresses, male artists sketched nudes with enthusiastic precision, claiming it was for aesthetic exploration. Museums collected erotic paintings under the guise of historical study, while every major university library had a locked section, nicknamed the Inferno, that housed the books no one was supposed to read but somehow always got requested. Scholars continue to debate the psychological gymnastics required to keep this two-faced morality functioning. Was it denial, projection, or just very selective memory? One theory suggests that the very intensity of the repression created the hunger for explicit content. In a world where even mentioning knees felt scandalous, the smallest exposure to anything sensual sparked a wildfire. Erotica was less about physical stimulation and more about emotional rebellion, a secret way to say, I know what you won't say out loud. You close one of these clandestine books and slip it back into its hiding place beneath the floorboards of a gentleman's study. The house is cleansed. The man's wife is asleep upstairs, unaware, or perhaps very much aware, of what he keeps behind the false wall of his bookshelf. This isn't about perversion. It's about craving authenticity in a world that punishes truth. Outside, the lamplighter passes the window, and the city goes dim. Behind countless curtains, people are reading, imagining, wanting, and pretending not to. It's late, the kind of late where the fire's down to embers and the ticking clock sounds like a metronome for secrets. You're in the scullery of a large Victorian home now, low ceilings and uneven stone floors underfoot. A copper kettle hums on the stove, and outside the kitchen door the house above sleeps peacefully. Or pretends to. Because down here, in the servants' quarters, the back stairwells, the shadowy hallways behind the polished ones, another world hums quietly beneath the surface. Tonight, you're with the butlers, maids, and footmen who saw everything and said nothing. You'd be hard-pressed to find another group in Victorian England with a better front-row seat to the hypocrisies of upper-class life. The domestic staff lived in the walls, quite literally. They slept in tiny, narrow rooms, rose before dawn and crept through the house like ghosts. Yet despite their invisibility, they were everywhere. They dressed their masters, scrubbed their linens, overheard their arguments, cleaned up the aftermath of scandal. And they knew the real stories: who was sneaking into whose bedroom, what letters had been burned, whose corsets were found under which bed. Let's start with the butler. Respected, perfectly groomed, and deeply unbothered by scandal. He keeps the household running smoothly while pretending not to notice that the master of the house spends long evenings in the study with his niece from Bath. He hears the muffled arguments through doors that were supposed to be soundproof. He finds a misplaced undergarment on the drawing-room floor and quietly pockets it before the lady of the house comes down for tea. His poker face is legendary. He could find a dead body in the dumbwaiter and still serve dinner on time. Then there's the lady's maid, a confidant who knows every inch of her mistress's body, because she bathes her, dresses her, laces her in and unpins her hair at night. She knows which perfumes mask which odours. She knows when her mistress is late for her monthly visitor, and how her hands tremble just a little more when her husband walks into the room. She knows too about the letter hidden in the sewing kit. She read it before it was sent, and she will never say a word. And let's not forget the footman, young, handsome, strategically silent. The role was half servant, half decor. His presence at dinner was as much about appearances as function. But upstairs? Sometimes he's invited for far more than candle lighting. There are quiet rumours of late-night summonses, accidental touches that were not accidents, locked doors opening too easily, a bored lady of the house, a neglected daughter, or perhaps the master himself. Everyone had urges, and everyone needed someone nearby they could pretend didn't count. Sexual harassment within domestic service was rampant, especially for young female servants. Most were teens from rural families, shipped off to the city to earn wages and learn discipline. What they learned instead was how little protection they had. If the master or his son cornered a scullery maid in the pantry, who was she going to tell? Her job depended on silence, and even if she did speak up, no one would believe her. The class hierarchy was airtight, and morality was only a weapon when wielded against the lower classes. Here's a disturbing fringe fact. There were actual advice columns in Victorian household manuals warning servants not to entice their masters, as if the 15-year-old maid was seducing the 50-year-old landowner on purpose. These manuals often framed sexual advances as unfortunate moral failings on both sides, but only one side ever lost their job over it. If a maid got pregnant, she was dismissed. If the master did, he changed the subject and poured another brandy. But domestic service wasn't just a hierarchy, it was a surveillance state. The upstairs family assumed their staff were too uneducated to understand what they witnessed. Big mistake. The servants watched everything. They knew when the lady of the house suddenly took to afternoon naps with locked doors. They noticed when the master began asking the undergardener to deliver notes instead of the footman. They saw the young heir coming home late with lipstick smeared on his cravat. They knew which guest got too drunk, too loud, too handsy. And they talked. Not in front of the family, of course, but in the kitchens, the laundries, the tiny rooms they were stuffed into at night. Information passed hand to hand like coal through a furnace. Some of it stayed as gossip. Some of it became leverage. There were stories of maids who threatened to tell and suddenly received generous severance pay and a glowing reference. There were cooks who knew too much and were kept on well past their usefulness, and occasionally a servant who vanished quietly after learning something they shouldn't have. One of the most infamous cases involved a high-ranking nobleman and a pregnant parlour-maid. She threatened to go public. He had friends in Parliament. She was institutionalised within a week, labelled unstable, discredited before she could speak. This wasn't unusual. When your moral system depends on appearance over truth, silence becomes a currency. Scholars still debate the degree of agency Victorian servants had in these situations. Were they passive observers, victims of systemic class abuse, or subtle players in their own right, navigating a corrupt system with quiet cunning? The answer is yes, all of the above. Some were exploited, some manipulated, some held power in whispers. There are letters from butlers who blackmailed their employers into pension plans, diaries from maids who used what they knew to climb social ranks. The official histories left them out, But the footnotes, oh, the footnotes are juicy. And here's the twist. While the upper class is obsessed over keeping up appearances, it was often the servants who held the keys to the real story. They were the memory of the house, the hidden archivists. Without them, the whole charade would have collapsed, but with them, it ran smoothly, if uncomfortably. You return to the scullery now, the kettle whistles, a maid yawns and reaches for her apron. Morning is coming, and soon the house will pretend once again that it is pure and perfect and peaceful, but beneath the floorboards and behind the curtains the servants know better. They always have. You're back outside again, this time on the edge of a bustling city square in the 1870s, surrounded by chimneys, carriages, and a low constant hum of gears, boots and ambition. This is the Victorian machine in full swing, factories churning, ledgers filling, railways slicing through the countryside. England has never been more powerful. And yet, tucked inside every respectable waistcoat is a man slowly being crushed under the weight of his own expectations. Welcome to the lonely, exhausted world of the self-made man, where repression isn't just a moral ideal, it's an emotional straitjacket. He's easy to spot, this model of Victorian masculinity. Upright posture, trimmed facial hair, a watch chain across his chest, and a gaze fixed squarely on the future. He's taught to believe that success is earned through discipline and restraint and never, under any circumstance, showing vulnerability. The ideal man is rational, industrious, modest, and emotionally bulletproof. Passion is for the uneducated, joy is indulgence, and tears, well, you might as well light your own reputation on fire. You follow him through his routine. He rises before dawn, reads the paper with one eye, still asleep, shaves without flinching. He works 10-hour days in an office where he can't even remove his jacket without signalling some kind of collapse. He returns home to a dinner served by a wife who's been told not to burden him with emotions or questions. He talks about stocks, or the weather, or how the price of coal is ridiculous. But what he doesn't talk about is the fact that he hasn't touched his wife in 6 months, or that he lies awake at night thinking about a man he once loved in school, or that he's terrified he'll die having never actually lived. This repression isn't just about sex, it's about feelings in general. Boys are trained from birth to stuff their emotions down into some kind of dark Victorian Tupperware and never open it again. Crying is weakness. Talking about emotions is weakness. Even enjoying something too much, music, wine, a beautiful sunset, risks being seen as effeminate. And so they grow up emotionally malnourished, wrapped in stoicism and sarcasm, pretending that everything's fine as their inner world calcifies. One fringe belief that made the rounds during this time was that male, seminal retention built strength, not just physically, but spiritually. The longer a man could go without release, the more powerful his intellect and willpower. Some self-help books even equated ejaculation with loss of vital life force, as though having an orgasm might cost you your job, your spine and your ability to balance a checkbook. Men were told to redirect those urges into productive labour, build a bridge, not a relationship. This led to the rise of muscular Christianity, a weirdly buff mix of piety and fitness. Men were encouraged to channel their pent-up energy into sports, empire building, or ideally both. Football became a moral crusade. Climbing mountains was considered character building. Taking cold baths before sunrise, apparently a fast track to sainthood. One man wrote in his journal, "Each time I conquer temptation, I find the strength to rise above lesser men." And by temptation, he meant looking at his housemaid for longer than 2 seconds. The tragedy is, no one really knew how to deal with the emotional damage this stoicism caused. There wasn't a name for depression that didn't also sound like a character flaw. If a man became anxious, detached, or angry for no clear reason, he was labelled overworked. If he drank himself into a stupor, it was chalked up to the burdens of masculinity. No one asked why he was unhappy, they just admired his quiet suffering. And he didn't dare say anything, because even having the language to describe his feelings was seen as suspect. You find him sitting alone in his study after dinner, glass of port in hand, staring into the fireplace. There are letters in the drawer he's never sent, some to friends, others to a brother he no longer speaks to. He's thought of writing something more honest, something vulnerable, but every time he picks up the pen, he stops. What would he say? I'm tired. I'm scared. I don't know how to talk to my own children. These are not sentences found in Victorian etiquette books. They're not even safe to say out loud in most rooms. Scholars have wrestled with the question of how much of this stoicism was sincere. Was the Victorian man really that emotionally cold? Or was it all performance? Some historians argue that men were in fact deeply emotional, but trained to express it through action, through work, loyalty, self-denial. Others believe many men were trapped in a system that offered no escape, quietly miserable but so afraid of shame or scandal that they swallowed their own voices. You pass through a gentleman's club, leather armchairs, pipe smoke, newspapers rustling like dry leaves. The conversation is measured, dry, and emotionally barren. No one talks about loneliness, no one mentions regret, but when a poem is read aloud, something sad, something aching, you see the flicker. A man clears his throat, another adjusts his collar, one glances away. For a moment it almost breaks through. The era even invented its own brand of melancholia, neurasthenia, the disease of the modern man. Symptoms included fatigue, irritability, lack of concentration, and an overwhelming sense of dread. Sound familiar? It was basically a 19th century way of saying, I've been repressing everything since I was 9 and now my soul is chewing through its own shoelaces. Treatments included electricity, vigorous walks, and, if you were lucky, rest at a sanitarium where no one asked questions. And here's the final absurdity. While these men were quietly falling apart, they were also being told they were the apex of civilization. The leaders of industry, the moral compass of the empire. The world was theirs to conquer, but their own inner lives were forbidden territory. They could map Africa, build railroads, pass laws, and write treaties, but they couldn't sit down and admit they missed their mother. You watch him put down his port and rise from the chair. He buttons his jacket, adjusts his cravat, and walks out of the study like nothing happened. Upstairs, his wife is asleep, or pretending to be. The house is quiet, his children tucked into beds he rarely visits. Tomorrow, he'll go to work. He'll shake hands, nod thoughtfully, issue orders, and be congratulated for how composed he is. And the sadness, that will stay locked away, somewhere behind his ribcage, right next to the dreams he stopped having years ago. The tropical sun hits you like a wall of steam, and just like that, you're not in London anymore. You're standing on the edges of a colonial outpost, somewhere in India, maybe Jamaica or the far edge of Africa, surrounded by palm fronds, starched linen uniforms, and a cloying sense of superiority. This is Victorian imperialism in full swing, and it's not just about flags and shipping routes. No, tucked within the civilizing mission is something else entirely, the missionary position, quite literally. Tonight we're unpacking how Victorian colonialism didn't just export railways and Christianity, it exported sexual repression too. Here's the setup. The British Empire, swollen with industry and moral panic, has decided it is not only the economic powerhouse of the world, but also the moral lighthouse. Victorian values, chastity, modesty, rigid gender roles are seen as the height of civilization. So naturally, it becomes the empire's duty to enlighten everyone else. It's not enough to build trade routes and force treaties. The native populations must be made proper, decent, and above all modest. You watch as British missionaries march through villages holding Bibles in one hand and pamphlets on European dress codes in the other. Indigenous women are told to cover themselves, shoulders, chests, sometimes even faces, because their traditional garments are suddenly immodest through the lens of Victorian morality. Never mind that the climate is sweltering. Never mind that these same bodies were once revered in their cultures for fertility, strength, or spiritual power. To the colonial mindset, they are simply naked, primitive, shameful. Meanwhile, British colonists, officers, governors, businessmen build their own communities abroad, complete with tea sets, social clubs, and imported wives when available. In theory, these colonial outposts are models of decorum. In practice, they're often hotbeds of contradiction. Affairs with local women are common if not expected. Children of mixed descent are born, then carefully denied. British men claim to be bringing Christian morals while simultaneously undermining them in their own bedrooms. The locals notice. So do the wives. Let's pause for a moment and talk about missionary schools. These were set up across the colonies, often with the stated purpose of education, but with a curriculum soaked in Victorian values. Girls were taught to sew, to pray, to cover themselves. Boys were taught discipline and the superiority of British customs. Sexuality was erased from the conversation entirely, unless it was being condemned. Indigenous dances, songs, even languages were censored if they were perceived as sensual. The entire body was put on trial, repackaged for palatability. One fringe and absurd fact: there were British anthropologists who insisted that so-called primitive societies were closer to nature and therefore more sexual, and this made them dangerous. One infamous theory claimed that the warmer the climate, the more lustful the people. It wasn't just pseudoscience, it was straight-up racial anxiety and academic drag. This justified even more aggressive moral reform efforts, as if you could bake sin out of a society by making them wear corsets and stop touching each other. Back in London, these efforts were celebrated. Newspapers ran the stories about native women rescued from indecency, complete with before and after portraits, half dressed in one, properly clothed in the other, looking miserably uncomfortable in both. Politicians boasted that British values were spreading, that they were bringing order to wild places. But if you scratch beneath the surface, the contradictions bled through. In private, many colonial officials treated local customs as exotic novelties, indulging in what they publicly condemned. And here's the gut punch. This wasn't just about clothing or behaviour, it was about power. By imposing Victorian sexual values on colonised peoples, the empire wasn't just moralising, it was dominating. Telling someone how to dress, how to touch, how to love, that's intimate colonisation. It creeps into your home, your bed, your body. It tells you that your way of being is wrong, that your family structure is wrong, that your desire is wrong. It's shame disguised as salvation. Even among the British themselves, colonial life offered a strange duality. Some found liberation, away from the prying eyes of London, social taboos loosened. Secret relationships, interracial liaisons, even queer partnerships existed in the margins, but they were always at risk. One scandal, one rumour, and careers ended. Respectability was a razor's edge, and the empire didn't tolerate those who slipped. The children born of these unions, often called Eurasians or Anglo-Indians, occupied a liminal space. Too British for the locals, too native for the colonists. They were frequently denied citizenship, inheritance, or proper education. Many were raised in orphanages run by missionary groups who saw their very existence as evidence of moral failure. Imagine growing up and being told in every polite Victorian way possible that your body is a mistake. Back home, these stories were rarely told. The official narrative was one of noble conquest, not emotional wreckage. Women who returned from colonial outposts rarely discussed what they saw, unless it was to remark on the strangeness of native customs. Men omitted the names of lovers who didn't speak English. The empire wrote its story in passive voice. No one ever admitted what they took. There's an ongoing scholarly debate about whether Victorian colonial morality was genuine or just a cover for control. Some argue that missionaries and reformers truly believed they were saving souls. Others see it as a calculated tool of dominance. After all, if you can convince someone they're impure, you don't have to beat them into submission. They'll do it themselves. Internalized shame is the most efficient kind of empire. You walk through a mission compound at dusk. A bell rings, signalling evening prayers. Children file in, heads down, uniforms crisp. The missionary smiles warmly as she hands out slates and scripture cards. Behind her, a young girl stares at the classroom wall, where a British map has been hung above the chalkboard. The whole world coloured red. A crown etched over every corner. She doesn't understand the map yet, but she already knows that her hair is wrong, that her voice is too loud, that her skirt must always be longer, and that her body is not hers. You're standing in a candlelit hall where women gather in secret, passing notes and glancing over their shoulders as if someone might burst through the door at any moment. There's no loud protest, no picket signs, just whispered resolve and clenched jawlines. This is the early women's rights movement in Victorian England, and it's complicated. Because while these women fight for their voices to be heard in public, they're still battling silence in private. Tonight, we're diving into the strange, halting relationship between the fight for suffrage and the deep, awkward dance around sexual autonomy. At first glance, it seems obvious. If women want the vote, shouldn't they also want freedom over their own bodies? But in the prim world of the 19th century, things weren't that simple. The suffrage movement had to navigate a society so allergic to the word sex that entire pamphlets were written in metaphors about light, liberty and motherhood. And even among the reformers themselves there was tension. Some wanted to tackle sexual double standards head on. Others were terrified that doing so would derail the entire movement. You meet two women, both suffragists, both brilliant, both exhausted. One believes that equality must begin with the right to say no, to demand sexual respect within marriage, to challenge the very idea that a woman's body is a husband's property. The other agrees in principle, but worries that if they say these things out loud, men, and even other women, will turn against them. Respectability was the currency of the suffrage movement, and nothing drained that account faster than talking openly about sex. So the movement splits itself down the middle. Publicly, many campaigns focus on property rights, education, and the soul. Safe issues, palatable, the kind of topics you can print in a family-friendly magazine. But privately, the letters and journals tell a different story. Women are desperate, trapped in marriages where their consent means nothing. Mothers of 5, 6, 9 children, their bodies worn down by pregnancies they never wanted and can't stop. Even when they march politely through Parliament Square, their minds are filled with things they're not allowed to shout. The irony is painful. In order to fight for freedom, these women often had to conform to the same ideals they were trying to dismantle. They dressed modestly, spoke softly, emphasized their femininity. They leaned into the Victorian ideal of the moral gentlewoman in order to prove that giving women rights wouldn't tear society apart. But in doing so, they couldn't fully advocate for sexual independence, not without risking the whole mission. You hear them speak in riddles. A woman must have control of her household. Translation: she wants the right to decide when and how she has sex. Women are not simply vessels for reproduction. Translation: please stop treating us like incubators. But the language remains cloaked in metaphor because society isn't ready for directness. It barely knows what to do with ankles, let alone a woman demanding the right to not be touched. This brings us to one of the fiercest and most polarising voices of the era, Josephine Butler. We met her earlier crusading against the Contagious Diseases Acts, but her activism stretched further. She spoke publicly, fearlessly about sexual abuse, exploitation, and the horror of a legal system that blamed women for men's behaviour. She named things, she didn't flinch. And many other suffragists wished she would shut up. Why? Because Butler's work linked the suffrage movement to sexual politics, and that scared people. Respectable women weren't supposed to know about brothels, let alone visit them to interview victims. Critics used her boldness to undermine the entire women's movement. They said, look, these women want to destroy morality, destroy families to these corrupt your daughters. So some suffragists distanced themselves, even as they secretly admired her bravery. And here's your bizarre fringe fact. Some early suffrage opponents claimed that giving women the vote would biologically damage their reproductive organs. Seriously, they argued that too much intellectual activity would draw energy away from the womb, leading to infertility, madness, or worse, a sexually independent woman with opinions. One pamphlet warned that voting women would grow moustaches. Another claimed that education caused a uterine displacement. The science was non-existent, but the panic was real. Even within the movement, there was debate over which women deserved rights. Middle-class reformers often ignored or sidelined working-class women, who were far more likely to be victims of sexual exploitation and far less able to cloak their demands in polite society language. These working women wanted reproductive autonomy, safety from assault, the right to refuse, but their voices were often drowned out by the more polished rhetoric of drawing-room feminists worried about tea-time respectability. Meanwhile, in Parliament, the male politicians who did consider women's suffrage usually focused on their roles as mothers and moral guardians. Let women vote, they'd argue, so they can help clean up the nation. It was never about independence. It was about giving women just enough voice to improve men's lives. You were allowed to care about sanitation and schooling, but if you started asking why your husband could rape you with legal impunity, you were labelled radical, or worse, unchaste. And so women played the long game. They sat through meetings, organised petitions, wrote articles that walked the tightrope of acceptability. They smiled while boiling inside. Many of them couldn't even speak openly among their own husbands about the parts of their lives they were trying to change. Imagine fighting for freedom while being told that freedom itself is unladylike. But despite all this, despite the fear, the silence, the social backlash, things began to shift, slowly, painfully. Women started to talk more openly about marriage reform, about the right to say no, about education that included their own biology. The movement began to fracture in productive ways, making room for more voices, more honesty. And with that honesty came hope. You leave the hall where the women are still gathered, still whispering plans. Outside, the night is quiet, but electric. A revolution doesn't always come with fireworks. Sometimes it comes with a woman writing her husband a letter she never intends to send. Or another refusing her marital bed for the first time in 20 years. Or a girl reading Mary Wollstonecraft by candlelight and realising that her body belongs to her. These aren't just political acts, they're intimate revolts, and even in silence they thunder. You're now in a lecture hall that smells faintly of chalk, sweat, and misguided confidence. At the front stands a man in a waistcoat pacing beneath a blackboard filled with Latin phrases and charts that look more like weather maps than science. The topic tonight: human improvement, genetic destiny. The noble goal of building a better society by controlling who gets to reproduce. That's right. Tonight, we're wading into the murky waters of Victorian eugenics, a movement that took the already warped sexual values of the era and gave them a scientific-sounding reason to exist. Eugenics didn't emerge fully formed in Victorian England, but this is where it found fertile soil, fed by classism, racism, colonialism, and an almost obsessive desire to categorise, label, and control. The man at the podium, that's likely Francis Galton, cousin of Charles Darwin and one of the founding figures of eugenics. Galton believed that society could be improved through selective breeding by encouraging the fit to have more children and quietly nudging the unfit out of the gene pool. And by unfit, he didn't mean anything medical. He meant poor people, criminals, the disabled, people with weak moral character, women who had sex before marriage, basically anyone who didn't look or act like him. You feel the audience nodding along, not because the logic is airtight, it isn't, but because it feels like a solution. Victorian society is terrified that it's teetering on the edge of moral collapse. Crime rates are rising, urban slums are swelling, families are getting harder to control. What if, they wonder, this is all because we're letting the wrong people reproduce? What if we could engineer virtue by managing desire? And that's the terrifying link. Eugenics takes sexual repression and wraps it in scientific vocabulary. Suddenly, shame isn't just social, it's hereditary. A woman with loose morals isn't just morally weak, she's biologically inferior. A man who can't control his urges isn't a sinner, he's genetically defective. Desire becomes dangerous not just because it offends God or society, but because it threatens the very bloodline of the empire. This kind of thinking seeps into everything. Public health campaigns warn against degenerate unions. Charitable homes for unwed mothers start quietly sterilising patients. Even asylums begin sorting inmates by perceived genetic risk. And all of it is done in the name of progress, improvement, rationality. Here's your chilling fringe fact. In the 1890s, some British reformers proposed marriage licenses that would require both parties to pass a moral and medical inspection before being allowed to wed. They even drafted templates. If you had a criminal record, an unbalanced temperament, or, heaven forbid, a family history of syphilis, you could be denied the right to marry. One paper argued that the state must defend itself from hereditary corruption with the same vigour it protects against foreign invasion. Yes, they actually said that. With straight faces. Women, of course, bore the brunt of this scrutiny. Victorian science claimed they were biologically more passive, less sexual, and naturally suited to motherhood, but only if they were from the right stock. Poor woman who enjoyed sex, dangerous. Disabled woman who wanted children, irresponsible. Woman of colour with a family, barbaric. The standards were impossible, and the consequences were real. One case study from the time involves a young woman labelled feeble-minded, simply because she struggled in school. She was institutionalised at age 16, sterilised at 22 and never released. Her file included the note, "A risk to future generations." That was the entire justification. Not illness, not crime, just the fear that she might give birth to someone equally inconvenient. And the worst part? These ideas didn't stay in fringe journals. They infiltrated everything from education to housing to immigration policy. Children were graded not just on academic ability but on moral hygiene. Entire neighbourhoods were mapped and classified based on desirable stock. If you grew up in the wrong place or looked the wrong way or had the wrong last name, you were quietly marked as less. Back in the lecture hall, the speaker is now drawing a pedigree chart on the board, showing how certain undesirable traits pass through generations. He uses real names, real families, people who live just a few blocks away. The audience takes notes, no one questions it. Science, they think, is objective, pure, above politics. But of course it isn't. It never is. Historians still debate how much influence Victorian eugenics had on later atrocities, the 20th century horrors we now associate with forced sterilizations and racial purity programs. Some say the Victorians just laid the ideological groundwork. Others argue that without this era's polite, pseudo-scientific obsession with breeding, the full machinery of modern eugenics would never have found traction. Either way, it's clear this wasn't a fringe belief. It was a dinner-table topic, a reform movement with good manners and terrible intentions. Even the women's rights movement wasn't immune. Some early feminists supported eugenics, seeing it as a way to ensure that only fit women, red, educated, middle-class, white, were empowered to raise children. It was a kind of moral gatekeeping disguised as progressivism. The idea that if women were finally going to be mothers on their terms, those terms had better include some very strict, very prejudiced rules. You step out of the hall and into the street, where posters advertise lectures on national vigour and pamphlets flutter on the cobblestones. The words sound noble, clean, scientific, but underneath, they're just another way to police bodies, to turn desire into diagnosis, to make sex not just shameful but selective. And that's the real danger. When repression is repackaged as rationality, it becomes harder to argue with. It wears a lab coat instead of a priest's collar. It uses charts instead of scripture. But it's still telling people the same thing. You are not worthy, you are not safe, you do not get to choose. The lecture is over, the lights go out. And somewhere, a young couple holds hands and wonders whether they are fit enough to love. The parlour smells like lavender polish and quiet desperation. You're perched on the edge of a tufted settee as a prim hostess in a high-necked gown straightens a lace doily with military precision. Everything here gleams with respectability, a word that Victorian England clutches like a security blanket dipped in starch and moral panic. But scratch just beneath the surface of this spotless room and you'll find a suffocating obsession that shaped an entire culture, the relentless, exhausting pursuit of decency. Respectability in Victorian society is less about virtue and more about performance. You don't have to be good, you just have to look good, always. The curtains must be drawn to the correct length, your gloves must be buttoned, and your speech must be trimmed of anything suggestive. Do you feel angry, sad, or horny? Excellent. Bury that under a layer of embroidery, or better yet, a discussion about the weather. Emotional transparency is vulgar. Polite society runs on pretending everything is fine, especially when it isn't. This obsession starts at birth. If you're a child in a respectable home, your body is monitored like it's under surveillance. Don't laugh too loudly, don't cry in public, don't run, sprawl, or, God forbid, fidget. Your toys must be gender appropriate. Girls get dolls and miniature tea sets. Boys get building blocks, miniature swords, and lectures about empire. Everything has a purpose, and the purpose is to signal propriety. Fast forward to adulthood, and the checklist only grows more complicated. You must marry correctly, dine correctly, raise children who speak when spoken to and never too brightly. If your neighbour sees you buying a second bottle of port or speaking too familiarly with the gardener, your entire social capital could implode. People won't confront you directly, of course. They'll just stop inviting you to dinners. You'll find yourself mentioned in soft, disappointed tones over lemon biscuits. Women are held to standards so specific they border on performance art. Her dress must be stylish but modest, her conversation lively but not opinionated. She may play piano but not too dramatically, read novels but not French ones. She must blush at innuendo but smile sweetly when someone makes a gentleman's joke. Her entire existence must oscillate between availability and chastity, emotion and control, motherhood and mystery. And men, they fare only slightly better. The respectable gentleman is firm but never loud, knowledgeable but never arrogant, sexual but never obviously so. He may visit a brothel but he must look vaguely appalled while doing it. He may enjoy whiskey but only in moderation and only after dinner. His role is to maintain the image of upright dignity, even if his personal life is disintegrating faster than the varnish on his antique cabinet. You get the picture. Decency is exhausting. One fringe fact that sums it all up. In the 1870s, etiquette books began offering advice on how to arrange furniture so that no lounging posture could be assumed. That's right, sofas were made deliberately uncomfortable to discourage laziness, and by extension, temptation, because God forbid someone get too comfortable and accidentally relax their moral compass. Respectability even colonized grief. When someone dies, mourning isn't just emotional, it's theatrical. Widows wear black for 2 years. Jewellery must be jet or not worn at all. You may not attend parties, or wear bright colours, or even laugh too freely. Expressing your sorrow in the wrong way, too much or too little, invites scrutiny. There were guidebooks for how to grieve correctly. Mourning, it turns out, has a dress code. And heaven help you if you're poor. The working class had to work twice as hard to appear respectable. A maid might save up her entire salary for a decent hat, just to avoid being mistaken for loose. A dock worker might iron his shirt obsessively for Sunday church, hoping to be seen as one of the good ones. The poor were expected to emulate the middle class in every way possible, except in comfort, of course. They were never allowed to forget their place. The Victorian press was a powerful enforcer of this hierarchy. Newspapers reported on crimes with salacious flair, especially when the accused was a fallen woman or a scandalous actress. But they praised noble restraint. The woman who forgave her cheating husband, a model of grace. The man who refused to acknowledge his illegitimate child, discreet. In Victorian logic, silence equals strength. Denial is practically a virtue. You enter a church on Sunday where respectability is on full display. Women in high collars, men with wax moustaches, children whispering their prayers. It's serene, orderly, and humming with tension. One man glances nervously at his neighbour, wondering if his recent absence has been noted. A woman kneels to pray, but her eyes flick briefly to the woman beside her. She knows about the affair. Everyone knows. No one says a word. The scholars' debate on this is rich. Was Victorian respectability a genuine moral compass, or a smokescreen for widespread repression? Some argue it was a necessary stabiliser in a rapidly changing society, offering a shared code of conduct in the face of industrial chaos. Others see it as a psychological prison, turning people into caricatures of themselves and creating a culture of surveillance, where everyone was both prisoner and warden. You see it in letters from the time, women writing about the unbearable strain of always being on, of never being able to rest, cry, or say what they actually feel. One woman confessed in a journal, Pinion, "My face is stitched into a smile, but I am undone at the seams." That line stayed hidden for years, tucked in a diary she never meant to be read. What's striking is how respectability didn't just shape behaviour, it distorted identity. People weren't just pretending to be moral, they began to believe that appearances were morality. If you looked good, you were good, and if you didn't, well, something must be wrong inside you. It's how an entire generation learned to ignore their own instincts, mistrust their feelings, and judge each other based on posture and petticoats. You return to the parlour, where the doily has been adjusted for the 3rd time in 10 minutes. The hostess offers you a biscuit with a smile that doesn't quite reach her eyes. The conversation dances politely around everything that matters. No one dares speak of desire, anger, fear, only weather, flowers, and the virtue of hard work. And as you sip your tea carefully, quietly, you realise that in a world obsessed with decency, honesty is the most indecent act of all. Rain taps softly against the glass as you make your way down a long corridor, echoing with the kind of stillness that makes you lower your voice instinctively. The walls are pale, the lighting dim, and the smell, antiseptic mixed with something older, dustier, lingers in the air. You're in a Victorian asylum now, where society quietly stores away its misfits, inconvenient women, and those who dared to behave too human in a world that demanded marble statues. Tonight, we're exploring how sexuality, mental illness, and gender blended into a cocktail of de-diagnosis and disappearance. If you were a Victorian woman who didn't conform, too loud, too melancholic, too sexually curious, there was a diagnosis ready for you: hysteria. It was the go-to explanation for any emotional behaviour doctors couldn't or wouldn't understand. Mood swings, hysteria. Too interested in sex, hysteria. Not interested enough in sex, hysteria. Tried to run away from your husband after your 3rd forced pregnancy? You guessed it. Full-blown, lace-trimmed hysteria. The word itself comes from the Greek hystera, meaning uterus. Yes, the Victorians literally believed the womb was the source of madness. Some even thought it could wander around the body, causing psychological distress wherever it went. One early medical drawing shows the uterus floating up toward the throat, as if your reproductive organs were balloon animals trying to throttle you from the inside. Science. Doctors, almost always male, developed elaborate methods to treat this so-called hysteria. Some favoured rest cures, where women were confined to bed, forbidden from reading, writing, or even talking too much. Others prescribed electrotherapy or ice baths, and in the most infamous cases, doctors performed what they called pelvic massages to relieve female tension. Essentially, medically sanctioned sexual stimulation delivered with a straight face and an air of clinical detachment. Some historians argue this practice led directly to the invention of the vibrator. So yes, your great-great-grandmother may have been prescribed an orgasm by a man who called it science. But the real horror begins when those women don't get better. When their depression, trauma, or rebellion refuses to evaporate politely. That's when they're sent here, to the asylums. These weren't hospitals in the modern sense. They were part prison, part warehouse. Many were underfunded, overcrowded, and cloaked in the language of care while functioning as dumping grounds for society's problems. Once inside, a woman could be held for years or forever. The legal standard for commitment was frighteningly low. A husband, father, or even brother could have a woman committed for something as vague as moral insanity, which included refusing sex, reading too many novels, or expressing strong political opinions. It's not paranoia if they really are locking you up for being inconvenient. And it wasn't just women. Men ended up in asylums too, especially if they violated the era's rigid sexual codes. Homosexuality, though not always openly named, was classified as a perversion, a pathology, a weakness of character. If a man was caught in an unnatural act, he could be institutionalized rather than imprisoned, especially if he had a family willing to keep things quiet. And what happened inside those walls? Electric shocks, isolation, endless observation. Your identity, once deviant, was stripped away under the guise of rehabilitation. A fringe fact that's unsettlingly real. In 1872, a respected physician published a paper arguing that masturbation was one of the leading causes of insanity. He claimed that self-abuse drained the body's vital energy and led to hallucinations, delusions, and early death. His proposed treatment, cold baths, dietary restrictions, and, if all else failed, surgical removal of the offending parts. Yes, you read that correctly, genital mutilation as medicine. That's what happens when guilt becomes doctrine. You walk past a padded room where a woman stares at the ceiling, silent still. No one knows why she stopped speaking. Maybe it was the drugs. Maybe it was the months of silence forced on her. Or maybe, after screaming for years into a society that refused to listen, she simply stopped. Her file lists her diagnosis as chronic hysteria with sexual delusions. Translation: she once told someone that her husband hurt her. Outside these walls, the same society that banishes these women continues to uphold impossible ideals. The angel in the house doesn't go mad. She doesn't cry for hours or fantasize about escape or crave anything her husband doesn't give her. So when the mask slips, when the smile cracks and the grief floods out, the solution is simple. Remove her, hide her ear, label her. Scholars continue to debate how many of these patients were actually mentally ill and how many were simply resisting the cage of their gender roles. Some researchers suggest that the majority of women committed during the Victorian period suffered from trauma, postpartum depression, or undiagnosed neurological conditions, none of which were understood at the time. Others point out that many women entered asylums healthy and emerged broken, victims of a system that promised treatment and delivered punishment. And what about the women who didn't end up in institutions? Many created private asylums in their own homes. You can see it in their journals, those entries about quiet despair, dark spells, and... God, forgive my thoughts. They lived in houses full of servants and silverware, yet found themselves trapped by walls no less confining than the ones here. You can't medicate away a soul that's been denied the right to feel. You return to the corridor, passing rooms that whisper more than they echo. Some doors are locked, others aren't. It hardly matters. The line between sanity and madness was never about health. It was about obedience. And in a world where sexuality and desire were treated like dangerous secrets, anyone who broke the silence risked being labelled insane. You step outside into the cool air. The gate closes behind you with a heavy clang. The asylum fades into the fog, but the logic that built it, that fear of women's desire, of emotional truth, of anything that can't be controlled, still lingers, quiet as ever. There's music in the distance, something delicate, lilting. A waltz played on an upright piano behind velvet curtains. You step into a grand Victorian theatre, all gilded balconies and heavy drapes, where the gaslights flicker like fireflies, and the air smells faintly of grease paint, perfume and sweat. The audience is composed of well-dressed ladies and their serious-faced husbands, opera glasses lifted to scrutinise every movement on stage. But backstage, the real performance is unfolding. Here in the shadows, sexuality dances unbound, and respectability takes off its mask. Welcome to the world of Victorian performance culture. The theatres, music halls and cabarets where society came to watch others break the rules it refused to let itself touch. The stage was a rare space where norms bent, flirted, and occasionally shattered. Here gender became fluid, corsets became costumes, and desire slipped into the open under cover of artistry. All the repression the audience wore like armour during the day, they shed it here, briefly, vicariously, in the dark. You duck behind the curtain, where actors and actresses, many of whom don't answer to Mr. or Miss unless they're on stage, apply rouge, adjust petticoats, and swig from shared bottles of gin. The leading man kisses his co-star on the cheek and flirts with the stagehand in the same breath. One chorus girl adjusts her wig, then slips into a waistcoat and top hat for her cross-dressing role, a music hall male impersonator, wildly popular at the time. Her fans include both men and women, and not all of them are drawn just by the performance. This kind of gender play wasn't just accepted, it was expected in certain entertainment circles. Music halls in particular embraced the outrageous. Their stars were often working-class women who had clawed their way into celebrity, and whose power came from walking the razor's edge between titillation and comedy. Think Marie Lloyd, Queen of the Music Hall, whose double entendres were so subtle that you could laugh at them publicly without admitting you got the joke. One of her most famous songs was She Sits Among the Cabbages and Peas. Say it out loud, slowly. What made these performances so subversive wasn't just the content, it was the freedom. On stage, a woman could wink, sing about bedroom escapades, flash an ankle, even suggest she enjoyed sex. And no one could stop her, because it was just performance. She was acting. A male impersonator could strut in trousers, hands in her pockets, oozing confidence, and the audience would cheer. But try that same swagger outside the theatre. Scandal. The same went for men. Some comic actors played women in drag, exaggerated and flamboyant, to huge applause. A man in a dress could be hilarious, as long as he didn't make it too real. Audiences loved gender bending on stage, but the line was sharp. The moment the performance hinted at genuine queerness or sexual ambiguity off stage, the mood turned sour. The public wanted their rebellion with a side of plausible deniability. A fringe fact from this glittery underworld: in the 1880s, a series of secret drag balls took place in London, often hosted by male performers who lived double lives, actors by day, gender rebels by night. Attendees dressed in full evening gowns, powdered their faces, and danced under candlelight. These events were illegal and extremely risky, but they offered a rare space for community and self-expression. Police raids were not uncommon. One raid in 1889 led to several arrests and headlines dripping with moral panic. But the balls kept happening because once people taste authenticity, even in secret, they don't let it go. Victorian theatre also held space for other taboos. Plays addressed forbidden romance, fallen women, and even coded queer relationships, though they had to veil the truth in allegory and symbolism. A man might declare eternal devotion to his closest friend, or a woman might suffer dramatically over her longing for a lady of higher social rank, and the audience could interpret it as tragedy, friendship, or something more, depending on how brave they felt that night. Still, the theatre world was no utopia. Many performers, especially women, faced constant judgment. Their on-stage freedoms didn't translate into real-life respect. Actresses were seen as morally suspect, half a step above harlots, as one preacher put it. Many women in the profession couldn't marry into polite society, no matter how talented or popular they became. Their bodies were public property, admired, discussed, sometimes assaulted, but never fully owned. This dichotomy ran deep. The same men who condemned actresses in Parliament came to see their shows every week. The same women who whispered about those girls bought their sheet music and copied their hairstyles. Respectability had a backstage pass, and it used it often. Everyone wanted to touch the fire without getting burned. There's a scholarly debate still simmering today. Were Victorian performance spaces liberating or exploitative? Were the cross-dressing acts and bawdy songs genuine rebellion, or just sanctioned deviance kept safely within the proscenium arch? Some historians argue that these stages allowed performers, especially queer and gender non-conforming artists, to express parts of themselves they couldn't explore anywhere else. Others argue that these freedoms were always conditional, performative in both senses of the word, and disappeared the moment the curtain fell. You watch the final act. The audience claps, a little too loudly, thrilled by their own daring to enjoy something so provocative. The leading lady bows, her smile dazzling, but her eyes flick nervously toward the gallery, scanning for a critic, a chaperone, a husband who won't understand the wink in her song. She exits, and the applause fades. Backstage, the energy changes. The costumes come off. The makeup is wiped away. One performer leans against the wall and lights a cigarette, still wearing part of his dress. Another stares into the mirror, her male costume half unbuttoned, lipstick still intact. In this fragile liminal space between performance and personhood, you see the truth. The theatre didn't escape Victorian repression. It just learned to dance with it. The curtain falls, the house lights rise, and outside the city resets itself, prim and proper, polished and fake. But inside that darkened theatre, something was whispered, or shouted, or sung, something too true for daylight, something that lingers. There's a click and a whir as the camera lens focuses, capturing the moment in a frozen haze of silver nitrate. You're standing in a Victorian photography studio, surrounded by velvet backdrops, potted ferns, and people trying very hard not to blink. But behind the stiff poses and blank expressions lies something deeper, because photography, like everything else in this era, wasn't just about capturing life. It was about controlling how life was seen, and more often than not, how it was hidden. Tonight, we peer into the lenses and under the negatives to reveal how Victorian England used photography to shape, disguise, and sometimes subvert its own relationship with sex and propriety. Let's start with the basics. Photography was new, mysterious, and utterly intoxicating to Victorians. By the 1850s, portrait studios were popping up all over England, promising to immortalise your likeness in a single soul-capturing image. Family portraits, mourning photos, engagement sittings, they were all the rage. But behind the curtains, in the locked drawers and secret folios, another kind of photography was developing, one that didn't show up in parlours or albums, one that rarely came with a frame. Enter the world of Victorian erotic photography. Not the wild, glistening explicitness of modern adult content. This was more subdued, more deliberate, and laced with the kind of soft focus that made it easier to file under art if you were ever caught. Nude women posed in Greco-Roman settings, draped in gauze, or pretending to be nymphs and goddesses. Eroticism disguised as mythology, or at least trying very hard to be. These images circulated in private collections, sold under the counter in select bookstores, or passed discreetly among friends, wrapped in brown paper naturally. And it wasn't all imported Parisian smut. British photographers were in the game too, often using models from the lower classes, actresses, chorus girls, even domestic servants supplementing their income. The irony was thick. The same women scolded for being too visible in public were now frozen naked in private, their images ogled by men who'd never let them dine in the same room. One model, known only as Miss L, appeared in over 200 photos in a 5-year span. Always anonymous. Always silent. Her face, her body, her image, commodified and yet erased at the same time. Some of these photographs walked a fine line between art and obscenity. There were strict laws against publishing indecent material, but the vagueness of that definition left plenty of room for interpretation. So a nude woman reclining in a pastoral scene might be allegorical, a corset undone by a fingertip, possibly educational if labelled study and form. This plausible deniability gave the era's repression a weird sort of loophole. As long as you called it art, you could stare all you liked. Here's a fringe gem for you. Queen Victoria herself was a fan of photography, and commissioned hundreds of portraits of her family. But one of her sons, Prince Albert Victor, was rumoured to have had a fascination with nude photography, particularly French imports, which led to several whispers about his extracurricular tastes. While historians are divided on whether he was truly scandalous or just the target of anti-royal gossip, the fact remains, even royalty wasn't immune to the magnetic pull of forbidden images. Photography also played a strange role in scientific attempts to classify and moralise the body. Criminologists and physicians began using mugshots, posture studies, and even nude photographs to try to link physical traits with deviance. If someone committed a sexual crime, or even just violated moral norms, their body might be photographed, studied, and displayed in journals. The underlying assumption? That immorality left visible traces, that you could see lust, perversion, or weakness if you looked closely enough. And of course, there were the post-mortem portraits, a uniquely Victorian genre in which the dead, especially children, were photographed as keepsakes. While not inherently sexual, these portraits reflected a broader cultural obsession with the frozen body, poised, passive, often beautified in death. Some scholars argue this fetishization of stillness bled into the way the Victorians viewed living bodies too, especially women's. Movement was the risk, animation was suspect. But a woman still, quiet and half-clothed under soft lighting, that was considered tasteful. Photographs also captured those living double lives, the actresses, performers, and courtesans who were both celebrated and condemned. One example is Lily Langtry, an actress and socialite often photographed in daring attire for the time. Her images danced just at the edge of acceptability, more suggestive than explicit, but enough to fuel rumours and fascination. She was both muse and menace, the embodiment of a woman who didn't know her place, or rather, kept changing it. And yet the Victorians clung to these images. For all their preaching, they collected them, locked them away, passed them between friends with hushed chuckles and guilty smiles. Some men had entire albums hidden behind fake book spines, next to their family Bibles, no less. The contrast is absurd but perfectly Victorian. Pretend in public, indulge in private, and convince yourself that the two are entirely unrelated. The scholars' debate is ongoing. Was Victorian erotic photography a form of rebellion or just another layer of objectification? Did these images give women agency, a way to make money and control how they were seen? Or did they trap them in yet another male fantasy, artful, distant, and voiceless? The truth probably lies in the murky middle. Some models posed willingly, others didn't. Some photographers respected their subjects, others didn't even learn their names. You watch a photographer adjust his lens. The model, a young woman no older than 20, tilts her chin slightly and stares just past the camera. She's been here before. She knows how to hold her body just long enough for the shutter. When the click comes, it's like a blink. Brief, cold, final. That moment will live longer than she ever will. Outside, the fog curls around the gas lamps, and people pass by the studio without looking in. They assume the photographs hanging in the window, children, weddings, landscapes, are the only ones being taken. The rest, the private ones, the ones that speak without words, will never be displayed. They were never meant to be, which is precisely why they mattered. You step through a narrow wooden door and find yourself surrounded by books, floor to ceiling, shelves packed so tightly that the scent of paper feels almost liquid in the air. A quiet bell chimes behind you. This is no ordinary Victorian bookshop. This is the kind of place where ideas, not just ink, are smuggled. Hidden in plain sight are the final whispers of rebellion, the early sexologists, the proto-psychologists, the radical thinkers who dared to ask one of the most un-Victorian questions imaginable. What if sexual desire isn't a sin, a sickness, or a secret? Tonight, we end our journey in the candlelit corners of the Victorian mind, where the first glimmers of modern sexuality begin to flicker into view. You run your fingers along the spines. Most are polite enough, Greek classics, theology, philosophy. But tucked between them are the real treasures. Books with false titles, monographs bound in plain brown covers, translations of French and German texts with pages that rattle like they've been turned too many times. These are the works that began, quietly and cautiously, to challenge the Victorian worldview. That maybe sex isn't something shameful to be crushed under layers of clothing and code, maybe it's something to be understood. Start with Richard von Krafft-Ebing, whose 1886 work Psychopathia Sexualis catalogued human sexual behaviours with a methodical, if deeply judgmental, tone. He coined terms like sadism, masochism, and fetishism, treating desire as a clinical subject, even if he often saw it as pathological. Still, the very act of writing these things down gave them shape, language, and, eventually, community. For the first time, people saw themselves described on paper, not in sermons, not in laws, in text. Krafft Ebing's work made its way to England, sometimes censored, sometimes abridged, but always hungrily read by those starved for understanding. His book wasn't exactly empowering, it pathologized much of what it documented, but it cracked the door open. Suddenly there was space to ask, if this is an illness, then where's the cure? And if there is no cure, then maybe it's not an illness at all. Enter Havelock Ellis, an Englishman whose work dared to suggest something even more shocking. That sexual desire was natural. That women could feel lust. That homosexuality wasn't a crime, but a variation of human experience. He co-authored the first English medical textbook to openly discuss same-sex attraction without condemning it, which was basically the academic equivalent of throwing a Molotov cocktail into a gentleman's club. Ellis's writings were dense, polite, and cautiously progressive. He didn't scream revolution. He whispered it. But in a world that punished honesty with exile, that whisper roared like thunder in the right ears. He interviewed people, recorded case studies, listened, and in doing so he laid the groundwork for what would eventually become sexology, the study of sexual behaviour not as sin or scandal, but as part of the human condition. Your fringe fact of the night: Havelock Ellis's personal life was just as complicated as his theories. He reportedly suffered from what he called sexual anhedonia, meaning he couldn't feel sexual pleasure in traditional ways. But he later discovered that he was aroused by the sight of women urinating, a fact he wrote about openly, with the same clinical detachment he brought to every other topic. Victorian England didn't have a polite word for that. Ellis created one. You leaf through a banned pamphlet tucked between two hymnals. It's a translation of a German essay arguing that gender and sexuality are fluid, that male and female are cultural scripts more than biological imperatives. The author writes in veiled language, careful not to trigger censors, but the meaning is unmistakable. The body is not the prison, shame is. And the key to freedom? Language. Because that's the trick, really. For centuries, sexuality had no vocabulary outside of sin and sickness. The act of naming homosexual, bisexual, heterosexual, transvestite, intersex gave people a map. Maybe not a perfect one, maybe one drawn in blood and misunderstanding, but it was a start. Still, the resistance was fierce. These books were banned, burned, discredited. Scholars lost their careers, readers were arrested. One London bookseller was jailed for distributing a scientific essay on homosexuality. Another had his entire inventory seized for selling a medical treatise that mentioned masturbation without calling it a moral disaster. The censors weren't just protecting children. They were protecting the fragile fiction of a world that claimed to know everything and feared anything it couldn't explain. But the readers kept coming, in twos and threes. A man in a bowler hat trembling as he slips a pamphlet into his coat. A schoolteacher with a false name and a hungry mind. A widow who wants to understand why she never desired her husband, and why she now dreams only of women. These are the quiet rebels. The ones who never throw bricks or write manifestos. They just want the truth. And even as the Victorian era gasped its last, the seeds it tried so hard to bury began to sprout. Freud would soon arrive with his cigar and his wild theories. Modern psychology would take root, flawed and messy, but curious. Art and literature would explode into expressionism, surrealism, desire painted bold across canvas and paper. And the people who had once lived in fear of their own bodies, they would start speaking, not just whispering, speaking. You look up from the pages. Outside, the gas lamps are flickering. The city is quiet, but not still. You can feel it. Underneath the rules, the rituals, the repression, a new kind of fire is catching. The kind that doesn't burn down but clears space for honesty, for complexity, for truth. And that, in the end, is what the Victorian sexual taboo was really afraid of. Not sin, not scandal, but freedom. The freedom to be seen as you are, not as someone else insists you must be. You leave the bookshop. The bell chimes again. A breeze carries the scent of ink and wood smoke. And somewhere, a girl lights a candle beside her mirror and opens a book she wasn't supposed to read. She turns the page. You're back in your room, now. The light's low. the air just cooler enough to make the blanket feel right, the kind of stillness that only shows up after a long, strange journey. And what a trip it's been, through velvet-draped parlours and fog-drenched alleyways, from the hushed corridors of Parliament to the cracked linoleum floors of forgotten asylums. You've wandered through bedrooms filled with silence and theatre stages dripping with laughter, through underground bookshops, photo studios, and colonial outposts. You've witnessed a society so obsessed with appearing moral that it forgot how to be honest. Now, with the weight of Victorian England still humming in your ears, it's time to sit in the quiet and ask what it all meant, not just for them, but for you. The Victorian age didn't invent sexual repression, but it did sharpen it into an art form. It painted over human complexity with beige wallpaper and lace curtains. It taught people to fear their own bodies, to mistrust their own desires, to bury truth beneath layers of etiquette, corsets, and legal codes. But it also, paradoxically, gave birth to the very forces that would one day dismantle all of that. In trying so hard to suppress sex, it ended up obsessing over it. And in obsessing over it, it accidentally documented it, labelled it, studied it, gave it language. That's the great bitter irony. Repression didn't erase sex from the Victorian world. It carved it deeper, into their literature, their laws, their science. And slowly, that hidden history began to leak through the cracks. It always does. Because human desire doesn't care about laced doilies or Latin mottos. It sneaks out in diaries, in dreams, in photographs no one's supposed to find. And eventually someone opens a drawer, turns a page, or, like you, leans in close enough to hear what was never supposed to be said aloud. So as you settle into your pillow, think of the women who refused to be erased, the men who risked prison to love honestly, the doctors who asked hard questions, the actors who winked from the stage, the maids who knew everything but said nothing, and the quiet rebels who made space for the rest of us by simply existing. We owe them. Now close your eyes, let the gas lamps dim, the corsets loosen, the curtains fall. Sweet dreams, brave listener.